Welcome to Storyflix Film, where movies are not just watched in a broken bar, they are experienced. Here, we bring you fast, powerful, and engaging movie recaps, turning full films into short, exciting stories without missing the thrill. From action-packed blockbusters to emotional dramas and mind-blowing sci-fi, we break it all down in a way that keeps you hooked till the end. So sit back, relax, and get ready, because every story here is a cinematic journey in minutes. Terminator 2, Judgment Day is a 1991 Americana science fiction action film directed by James Cameron, who co-wrote the script with William Wisher, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, Linda Hamilton, and Robert Patrick. It is the sequel to the Terminator 1984, and is the second installment in the Terminator franchise. In the film, the malevolent artificial intelligence Skynet sends Terminator, a highly advanced killing machine, back in time to 1995 to kill the future leader of the human resistance, John Connor. When he is a child, the resistance sends back a less advanced, reprogrammed Terminator to protect Connor and ensure the future of humanity. The Terminator was considered a significant success, enhancing Schwarzenegger's and Cameron's careers, but work on a sequel stalled because of animosity between the pair and the Hemdale Film Corporation, which partially owned the film's rights. In 1990, Schwarzenegger and Cameron persuaded Coralco Pictures to purchase the rights from the Terminator producer Gaylonda and Hemdale, which was financially struggling. A release date was set for the following year, leaving Cameron and Wisher 7 weeks to write the script. A principal photography lasted from October 1990 to March 1991, taking place in and around Los Angeles and on an estimated $94.102 million budget, making it the most expensive film ever made at the time. The advanced visual effects by Industrial Light Magica, ILM, which include the first use of a computer-generated main character in a blockbuster film, resulted in a schedule overrun. A theatrical prints were not delivered to theaters until the night before the picture's release on July 3, 1991. Terminator 2 was a critical and commercial success, grossing $519.9 million at the box office to become the highest-grossing film of 1991 worldwide and the third highest-grossing film of its time. The film won several accolades, including a Saturn, a BAFTA, and Academy Awards. A Terminator 2 merchandise includes video games, comic books, novels, and a T2 3D Battle Across Time, a live-action attraction. Terminator 2 is considered one of the best science fiction, action, and sequel films ever made. It is also seen as a major influence on visual effects in films, helping usher in the transition from practical effects to reliance on computer-generated imagery. The United States Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry in 2023. Although Cameron intended for Terminator 2 to be the end of the franchise, it was followed by several additional films: Terminator 3, Rise of the Machine 2003, Terminator Salvation 2009, Terminator Genesis 2015, and a Terminator, Dark Fate 2019, as well as a television series, Terminator, The Sarah Connor Chronicles 2008-2009. Plot: in 2029, Earth has been ravaged by the war between the malevolent artificial intelligence Skynet and the human resistance. Skynet sends the T-1000, an advanced, shape-shifting prototype Terminator made of virtually indestructibly liquid metal back in time to kill resistance leader John Connor when he is a child. To protect John, the resistance sends back a reprogrammed T-800 Terminator, a less advanced metal endoskeleton covered in living tissue. In 1995 Los Angeles, John's mother Sarah is incarcerated in Pescadero State Hospital for her violent efforts to prevent Judgment Day. The prophesied events of August 29, 1997, when Skynet will gain sentience and, in response to its creator's attempts to deactivate it, incite a nuclear holocaust. John, living with foster parents, also considers Sarah delusional and resents her efforts to prepare him for his future role. The T-1000 locates John in a shopping mall, but the T-800 intervenes, coming to John's aid and enabling his escape. John calls to warn his foster parents, but the T-800 deduces that the T-1000 has already killed them. Realizing the T-800 is programmed to obey him, John forbids it to kill people and orders it to help him rescue Sarah from the T-1000. The T-800 and John intercept Sarah as she attempts to escape the hospital. Initially horrified that the T-800 resembles the Terminator sent to kill her in 1984, she joins them and escapes the pursuing T-1000. Sarah uses the T-800's knowledge of the future to learn that a revolutionary microprocessor, being developed by Cyberdyne engineer Miles Dyson, will be crucial to Skynet's creation. Over the course of their journey, Sarah sees the T-800 serving as a friend and father figure to John, who teaches it catchphrases and hand signs while encouraging it to become more human-like. Sarah plans to escape to Mexico with John, but a nightmare about Judgment Day prompts her to decide to kill Dyson. She attacks him in his home but cannot bring herself to go through with it and relents. John arrives and reconciles with Sarah while the T-800 explains to Dyson the future consequences of his work. Dyson reveals that his research has been a reverse engineered from the hicbula and severed arm of the 1984 Terminator. Believing that his work must be destroyed, Dyson helps Sarah, John, and the T-800 break into Cyberdyne, retrieve the CPU and the arm, and set explosives to destroy the lab. The police assault the building and fatally shoot Dyson, until he detonates the explosives as he dies. The T-1000 pursues the surviving trio, cornering them in a steel mill. Sarah and John split up to escape while the T-1000 mangles the T-800 and briefly deactivates it by destroying its power source. The T-1000 assumes Sarah's appearance and voice to lure out John, but Sarah intervenes and, along with the reactivated T-800, pushes it into a vat of molten steel, where it disintegrates. John also throws the 1984 Terminator's arm and CPU into the vat. The T-800 explains that it must also be destroyed to prevent it from serving as a foundation for Skynet. Despite John's tearful protests, the T-800 persuades him that its destruction is the only way to protect their future. Sarah, having come to respect the T-800, shakes its hand and lowers it into the vat. The T-800 gives John a thumbs up as it is incinerated. As Sarah drives down a highway with John, she reflects on her renewed hope for an unknown future, musing that if the T-800 could learn the value of life, so can humanity. Cast. See also a list of the Terminator characters. Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator, a reprogrammed Model 101 Series 800 T-800 Terminator that is composed of human tissue over a metal endoskeleton. I sense Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor, a self-trained soldier who is dedicated to preventing the rise of Skynet. I sense Edward Furlong as John Connor, Sarah's son who is destined to lead the human resistance in opposition to Skynet. A sense Robert Patrick as T-1000, an advanced, shape-shifting prototype Terminator composed of liquid matter. A sense Earl Bona as Dr. Peter Silberman, Sarah's doctor at Pescadero State Hospital. A sense Joe Morton as Miles Bennett Dyson, Director of Special Projects at Cyberdyne Systems Corporation. The film's cast also include Jeanette Goldstein and Xander Bergelia as John's foster parents Janelle and Todd Voigt. I see a tilde inverted exclamation mark Stulogra as Sarah's friend Enrique Salceda. A.S. with the Merkersona and Devon Nixon as Dyson's wife Teresa and son Danny, and Danny Cooksia as John's friend Timmy Hamilton's twin sister, Leslie Hamilton Karen, appears as Sarah Connor in scenes where Linda Hamilton portrays the T-1000 impersonating Sarah. Twins Don and Dan Stanton portray a guard at Pescadero State Hospital and the T-1000 imitating him. Other cast members includes Ken Gibble as an abusive orderly Robert Winley, Aaron Young, Charles Robert Brown, and a Pete Shruma as men who confront the T-800 in a biker bar. Abdul Salam El Razak as Gibbons, a Cyberdyne guard, and Adim Naarisa as the SWAT team leader. A Michael Edwards that portrays the John Connor of 2029. and Hamilton's infant son Dalton Abbott portrays John in a dream sequence. A co-writer William Wisher cameos as a man photographing the T-800 in the mall, and Michael Biehn reprises his role as Resistance soldier Kyle Reese in scenes that were removed from the theatrical release. Production. The Terminator era, 1984, had been a surprise hit, earning $78.4 million against its $6.4 million budget, confirming Arnold Schwarzenegger's status as a lead actor and establishing a James Cameron as a mainstream director. Schwarzenegger expressed interest in a sequel, saying, "I always felt we should continue the story. I told Cameron that right after we finished the first film." Cameron said Schwarzenegger had always been more enthusiastic about a sequel than he was, because Cameron considered the original a complete story. Discussions to make a sequel stalled until 1989, in part owing to Cameron's work on other films such as Aliensa, 1986, and The Abyss, 1989, but also because of a dispute with rights. Due 50% of his rights to the company to get the Terminator remade. Cameron had also sold half of the remaining stake to his ex-wife Gail Ann Hurd, producer and co-writer on the first film, for $1 following their 1989 divorce. By 1990, Hemdale was being sued by Cameron, Schwarzenegger, Hurd, and special effects artist Stan Winston for unpaid profits from The Terminator. Holder Hemdale Film Corporation. A Hemdale co-founder John Daly, against Cameron's wishes, had attempted to alter the ending of The Terminator, nearly resulting in a physical confrontation. A sequel could not be made without Hemdale's approval, as Cameron had and Schwarzenegger, aware Hemdale was experiencing financial difficulties, convinced Carolco Pictures to purchase the film rights to The Terminator. Having worked with the independent film studio on the big-budget science fiction film Total Recall, 1990, owner Mario Casar described the rights acquisition as the most difficult deal Carolco ever conducted. He accepted a $10 million offer for Hemdale's share, considering it a sum fabricated to ward him off, and paid her $5 million for her share. Prior to development, the total cost of the acquisition rose to $17 million after factoring in incidental costs. Casar told Cameron that in order to recoup his investment, the film would proceed with or without him, and offered Cameron $6 million to be involved and write the script. The film would become a collaboration between several production studios: Carolco, Ayala Studio Canal Plus, Cameron's Lightstorm Entertainment, and Herd's Pacific Western Productions. The studio also had an existing U.S. distribution deal with the TriStar Pictures, which stipulated that the film be ready for release by May 27, 1991, a Memorial Day. Writing. With a scheduled release date, Cameron had 6 to 7 weeks to write the sequel. He approached his frequent collaborator and The Terminator co-writer William Wisher in March 1998. They spent 2 weeks developing a film treatment based on Cameron's vision to form a relationship between John Connor and the T-800, a concept Wisher believed was a joke. Their treatment diverged from the science fiction slasher theme of the original, focusing on the unconventional family bond formed between Sarah, John, and the T-800. Cameron said this relationship is the heart of the movie, comparing it to Theatin Mana receiving a Heartina the Wizard of Oz. 1939. Cameron's concept featured Skynet and the Resistance each sending a T-800, both played by Schwarzenegger, into the past, one to kill John and the other to protect him. Wisher believed a fight between two identical Terminators would be boring. The pair briefly considered a larger Super Terminator, but found it uninteresting and adopted an early idea Cameron had for the Terminator, a liquid metal Terminator resembling an average-sized human, in contrast to Schwarzenegger's large frame. The first half of their concept concluded with the destruction of Skynet's T-800, forcing it to use the T-1000, its ultimate weapon. Although he once considered removing the T-1000 altogether, Cameron solidified it as the only antagonist. Cameron and Wisher had the T-1000 take on the appearance of a police officer, allowing it to operate with less suspicion. Wisher found it challenging to depict the T-800 as good without making it non-threatening at the same time. The pair decided to give it the ability to learn and develop emotions, becoming more human over time. They kept the T-800's dialogue brief, relying on the audience to infer a lot of meaning through small bites. Its catchphrase, "Hasta la vista, baby," was something Wisher and Cameron said after their telephone calls. Wisher developed the first half of the treatment at Cameron's home over the course of 4 weeks, while Cameron worked on the latter half. Many pages were removed, including a convoluted subplot about Dyson, and a massacre of a camp of survivalists helping Sarah. Cameron, who did not consider the budget while writing, had to cut some elaborate scenes, including a 9-minute opening that showed a time travel machine being used in 2029. Wisher and Cameron also frequently conferred with special effects studio Industrial Light Magica, ILM, to determine which ideas were achievable. Cameron and Wisher analyzed the first film to help envision each character's development and evolution. Cameron believed Sarah's knowledge of a future would isolate her, forcing her to associate with survivalists and become a self-sufficient commando. She was written to have become an emotionally cold and distant character comparable to a Terminator, especially when deciding to go after Dyson. Instead of the story beginning with Sarah, John is placed with a foster family to increase tension. John's character was inspired by the 1985 Sting song Russians, with Cameron recalling, "I remember sitting there once, high and I was struck by the lyrics, 'I hope the Russians love their children too.' And I thought the idea of a nuclear war is just so antithetical to life itself." That's where John came from. They spent 3 days refining the script before flying to Cannes, where Terminator 2A was announced in early May 1998. Schwarzenegger initially struggled with portions of the script, once asking what is polyalloy. He also expressed concern about his character's non-lethal depiction, which conflicted with his action hero persona and portrayal of the character the Terminator. Cameron explained he wanted to defy audience expectations. Schwarzenegger requested, "Just make me cool." Casting Schwarzenegger became interested in reprising his role after finding the character more complex and sympathetic than in the previous film. To accurately portray a fearless and emotionless machine, he trained extensively with stunt coordinator Joel Kramer to remain unaffected by fire and explosions around him. Schwarzenegger earned $12.15 million for his involvement. Caralco had been blamed for the increase in exorbitant salaries paid to actors, having paid Schwarzenegger around $11 million for a total recall. 1990. They justified the expense as the value of their leads' wide appeal in markets outside the USA. To lessen the immediate financial burden, Caralco paid most of Schwarzenegger's salary with a financed $12.75 million a Gulfstream IE jet. Cameron refused to recast Hamilton's role but developed plans to work around her absence if she chose not to return. Negotiations were protracted but concluded promptly after Cameron informed Caralco the script could not be finished until he knew if Hamilton would be involved. Hamilton received roughly $1 million, which she described as quite a bit more than her earnings for The Terminator, but expressed disappointment at the pay disparity between her and Schwarzenegger. Hamilton requested that Sarah exhibit a crazy demeanor, explaining that after years of living with the impending doom of humanity, she believed Sarah would have transformed into an untamed entity, a warrior combined with a psychologically unstable woman. She continued, "The T-800 is a better human than I am, and I'm a better Terminator than he is." Cameron considered giving the character a facial scar but determined that applying it daily would be difficult. Hamilton undertook extensive preparation for her role, working with a personal trainer for 3 hours a day, 6 days a week, and maintaining a strict low-fat diet, losing about 12 pounds, 5.48 kg, of body weight. She also received judo and military training from former Israeli commando Uzi Galay. Between training, filming, and spending time with her infant son Dalton, Hamilton averaged only 4 hours of sleep per day. She described her experience as sheer hell but enjoyed showing off her new physique. Hamilton's twin sister, Leslie, was also cast in scenes where 2 versions of Sarah appear on screen simultaneously. Patrick, who was 31 and living in his car, was one of several actors in their late 20s considered for the T-1000 role. Cameron wanted a live actor resembling a newly recruited police officer to contrast with Schwarzenegger. According to Cameron, if the T-800 series is a kind of human panzer tank, then the T-1000 series had to be a Porsche. Casting director Molly Finna believed Patrick had the intense presence they wanted. Patrick auditioned by acting like an emotionless hunter and later participated in a screen test to judge the way lighting worked with his skin and eyes. For his character, he drew inspiration from Schwarzenegger's performance in the Terminator and observed hunting creatures as reptiles, insects, cats, and sharks. Patrick's facial expressions were based on those of an eagle, keeping his head tilted down to imply constant forward movement. He also employed a mixture of military posture with martial arts to express a fluid motion that differed from the T-800's rigid movements. The role demanded that Patrick be lean and fast, requiring peak physical shape. He learned to sprint without displaying heavy breathing and exhaustion, and received specialized training from Galley weapons master Harry Liu taught Patrick to operate and reload weapons, such as the T-1000 Suburban 92s, without looking and eventually without blinking. Singrabili Dolo was originally cast for the role before seriously injuring his leg in a motorcycle crash. In a 2021 retrospective, Cameron said Idol had an interesting aesthetic, but in hindsight, he probably would not have cast him. Singra Blackie Lawless if the rock band W.A.S.P.A. was also considered but deemed too tall. Furlong, among hundreds of other prospects, secured the role of young John Connor at his last audition. Cameron believed that early candidates for the role were either overexposed in other media or came from advertisement backgrounds, which trained them to be happy and perky. Furlong had no acting experience and was discovered by Finn at the A Boys Girls Club in Pasadena. Cameron described Furlong as having a surliness, an intelligence, just a question of pulling it out. He was required to take acting lessons, learn Spanish, and be able to ride a motorcycle and repair guns. Charlie Cauersmoa stated that he was offered the role, but was contractually obligated to appear in What About Bob? 1991. Joe Morton believed his casting as Miles Dyson had to do with Cameron wanting a minority character to be integral to the changing of the world. Morton avoided interacting with the cast so that their on-screen relationships would seem believably distant, as the role of Dyson was. The planned 3 months of pre-production was reduced to meet the release schedule, leaving Cameron without the time he wanted to prepare all aspects before filming began. Over a week, he spent several hours each day choreographing vehicle scenes with toy cars and trucks, filming the results, and printing the footage for storyboard artists. There was no time to properly test practical effects before filming, so if effects did not work, the filmmakers had to work around them. Principal photography began on October 8, 1990, with $68 million reduced after the preferred casting choice, Denzel Washington, declined it because the role mainly required him to act scared. Filming budget. Scenes were filmed out of sequence to prioritize those requiring extensive visual effects. Schwarzenegger found this difficult because he was meant to convey subtle signs of the T-800's progressive humanity and was unsure what was fitting for each scene. Cinematographer Adam Greenberg, who also worked on The Terminator, described the greater scope of the sequel as the most daunting prospect. Where he had been able to shout instructions to his crew on the original film, he used one of 187A walkie-talkies to conduct efforts over an expansive area. The production was arduous, in part because of Cameron, who was known for his short temper and uncompromising dictatorial manner. The crew made t-shirts bearing the slogan "You Can't Scare Me, I Work for Jim." Cameron. Schwarzenegger described him as a supportive but demanding taskmaster with a fanaticism for physical and visual detail. Even so, by the 101st day of filming, Schwarzenegger and Hamilton were frustrated by the high number of takes Cameron performed, spending 5 days just on close-ups of Hamilton in the Dyson home. To stay on schedule, Cameron worked through Christmas and persuaded Schwarzenegger to cancel a visit to American troops in Saudi Arabia with U.S. President George H.W. Bush to film his scenes. The production was filmed in many locations in and around Los Angeles. The now destroyed Corral Bar in Silma is where the T-800 confronts a group of bikers. Location manager Jim Maurisa chose Corral because it was raised above ground, allowing the scene to take place over different levels. The 1991 police beating of Rodney King took place at the same location a week after filming, being captured on the same videotape a spectator used to capture the filming of the biker bar scenes. On one occasion, a woman who was oblivious to ongoing filming walked into the bar. When she asked Schwarzenegger, who was wearing only a pair of shorts, what was going on, he replied, "It's male stripper night." Executives suggested cutting the scene to save money, but Cameron and Schwarzenegger refused. The T-1000's arrival in 1995 was filmed at the 6th Street Viaduct, and John's hacking of an ATM was filmed at a bank in Van Nuys. His foster parents' residence is in the Okanoga Park neighborhood, deliberately chosen for its generic appearance. The Terminator's confrontation with John takes place in Studio Santa Monica Plaza Mall, although exterior shots were captured at Northridge Fashion Center because there was less traffic in the subsequent scene. Patrick's training allowed him to outrun John on his dirt bike, so the bike's maximum speed was increased. The T-1000 continues its pursuit using a truck, in a scene filmed at the Bull Creek Spillway. Other locations include the Lakeview Terrace Hospital, Standing Nas Pescadero State Hospital, and the Peterson Automotive Museum was used as its garage. In a 2012 interview, Hamilton said she suffered permanent partial hearing loss after not wearing earplugs during the hospital elevator scene, where the T-800 fires a gun, as well as a shell shock from months of exposure to violence, loud noise, and gunfire. Elysian Park serves as the site of Sarah's apocalyptic dream, and scenes at the Dyson home were captured at a private property in Malibu. At the Cyberdyne building's destruction was filmed at an abandoned office in San Jose, scheduled for demolition. To bring a heightened sense of authenticity, real members of the Los Angeles Police Department's SWAT division were featured in the scene, although Cameron embellished their tactics to be visually interesting. In a spontaneous decision during Morton's death scene, Cameron opted to detonate nearby glass to examine its visual impact. The final highway chase was filmed along the Terminal Island Freeway near Long Beach, of which a 2.5-mile, 4.08 km, stretch was closed to traffic every night for 2 weeks. Scenes set during the future war of 2029 were filmed in the rubble of an abandoned steel mill in Oxnard, California, in a 1/2 square mile, 1.38 km space that was enhanced with burned bicycles and cars from a 1989 fire at the Universal Studios lot. A Terminator 2's ending was filmed in the Closa de Kaiser steel mill in Fontana, which Greenberg made appear operational mainly through lighting techniques. Despite appearing to be actively smelting steel, the mill was frigid and dangerous because of the moving machinery and high catwalks. The T-800's thumbs up during its death was added during filming. Hamilton considered it too sentimental. 6 months of filming concluded on March 28, 1991, about 3 weeks behind schedule. Post-production Terminator 2A was edited by a Conrad Buff IV, a Richard A. Harris, and a Mark Goldblatt, who said although there was more time to edit than in The Terminator, it was still relatively small given the greater scope of the sequel. They described the complexity of scenes such as the final battle between the Terminators, which required a seamless combination of live action, practical effect shots, and CGI. After having to rush editing at the end of The Abyss, Cameron limited filming in Terminator 2 8 to 5 days a week so he could help edit the film on weekends from the start of filming. Several scenes were deleted, in part to reduce its running time. These include Kyle Reese appearing to Sarah in a dream and encouraging her to continue fighting, Sarah being beaten in the hospital at the T-1000 killing John's dog, a scene the animal-loving Patrick was not a fan of, John teaching the T-800 to smile and discussing whether it fears death, the T-1000 malfunctioning after being frozen in the steel mill, and additional scenes with Dyson's family. Schwarzenegger unsuccessfully rallied to retain his favorite scene, in which John and Sarah modify the T-800's CPU, allowing it to learn and evolve, and Sarah attempts to destroy the CPU but John defends the T-800. The scene was replaced with dialogue indicating that the T-800 already possesses the ability to learn. The scripted ending depicted an alternative 2029 that was filmed at the Los Angeles Arboretum in Arcadia, in which an aged Sarah narrates how Skynet was never created while John, now a U.S. Senator, plays with his daughter in a Washington, D.C., playground. To make the film more evocative and memorable, Cameron changed this scene to one in which the characters look out at the road ahead. The production ran until about 2 days before the film's theatrical release. Delays were caused mainly by the rendering of shots out of Consolidated Film Industries, the most difficult of which was the T-1000's death. Co-producer Stephanie Austin said the production crew worked 24-hour shifts and slept on site. The 137-minute-long release printout was delivered to theaters the night before its release. There were 2 private pre-release screenings, one for family, friends, and crew at a Skywalker Ranch, and another in Los Angeles for studio executives. Austin said, "People were stamping their feet and clapping for 10 or 15 minutes, at which point the crew knew they had succeeded." During test screenings, the ending was well received, and was described as a touching favorite scene. The minimum estimated cost to produce a Terminator 2A had been $68 million, dwarfing the budget of the first film. Cameron and Schwarzenegger said the final budget, excluding marketing, was about $78 million. And the cost of making the film was about $51 million. According to Coralco executives Peter Hoffman and Roger Smith, the film cost $75 million before marketing, saying a Terminator 2A was only modestly over budget. Including marketing and other costs, the film's total budget is reported to have been between $94 million and $102 million. Kasser said he had secured 110% of the budget from advances and guarantees of $91 million, including North American television, $7 million, and home video, $10 million, rights, and $61 million from theatrical, home video and television rights outside the U.S. The distribution deal with TriStar Pictures earned it a set percentage of the budget, an estimated $4 million. News sources labeled it Terminator 2 the most expensive independent film ever and predicted it would bankrupt Coralco. Special effects and design. Main article: Special effects of Terminator 2, Judgment Day. A 10-month schedule and about $17 million of Terminator 2's budget was allocated just for special effects, including $5 million for the T-1000 alone, and a further $1 million for stunts. At the time, one of the largest ever stunt budgets. 4 main companies were involved in creating the 150 visual effects. ILM Special Effects Supervisor Dennis Murina managed the computer-generated imagery, CGI, effects, Stan Winston Studio at the prosthetics and animatronics. Fantasy 2 Film Effects developed miniatures and optical effects, and for Award Productions was responsible for creating a nuclear explosion effect. A Pacific Data Images and Video Image provided additional visual effects, the former doing digital wire removal and the latter creating the Termavision POV. The cost and time involved in producing CGI meant that the effect was used sparingly, appearing in 42 shots, alongside 50 practical effects. Portraying the T-1000 was a risky endeavor, as CGI was in its infancy and there was no backup plan in place if the CGI did not work as intended or could not be composited effectively with Winston's practical effects. The computer systems needed to animate and render the T-1000 CGI cost thousands of dollars alone, but creating the character also relied on a variety of practical appliances, visual illusions, and filming techniques. A team of up to 35 at ILM was required for the 5 minutes of screen time the T-1000's effects appear, and the process was so complex that rendering 15 seconds of footage took up to 10 days. Music: see also Terminator 2, Judgment Day, score. And You Could Be Mine. The Terminator composer Brad Fiedler returned for the sequel, working in his garage in Studio City, Los Angeles. Film industry professionals regarded his return with concern and skepticism as they believed his style would not suit the film. Fiedler quickly realized he would not receive the finished footage until late in the production after most effects were completed, which made it difficult to commit to decisions such as use of an orchestra because, unlike ambient music, the score had to accompany the on-screen action. Fiedler and Cameron wanted the musical tone to be warmer due to its focus on a nobler Terminator and young John. Fiedler experimented with sounds and shared them with Cameron for feedback. The Terminator score had mainly used oscillators and synthesizers, Fiedel recorded real instruments and modified their sounds. He developed a library of sounds for characters such as the T-1000, whose theme was created by sampling brass instrument players warming up and improvising. Fiedel said to the players, "You're an insane asylum. You're a bedlam of instruments." He slowed down the resulting sample and lowered the pitch, describing it as artificial intelligent monks chanting. Cameron considered the 8-tonal sound too avant-garde, to which Fiedel replied, "You're creating something that people have never seen before, and, the score, ought to sound like something people have never heard before to support that." TriStar asked Schwarzenegger to arrange a tie-in music video and theme song for the film. He chose to work with rock band Guns N' Roses because they were popular and there was a rose in the movie and Bloody Guns. The band offered the use of You Could Be Mine, the debut single from their album A Use Your Illusion IA, 1991. The music video, featuring Schwarzenegger as the T-800 pursuing the band, was directed by Stan Winston, Andrew Morhan, and Jeffrey Olsen. Patrick unsuccessfully lobbied to use Head Like a Hole by a 9 Inch Nails as the tie-in song, in part because his brother, Richard Patrick, was their tour guitarist. Wisher suggested using Bad to the Bone by George Thorogood the Destroyer as the T-800 puts on the biker clothes. Although Cameron did not like the idea, Wisher said he later found that Cameron had used the song but had forgotten it was his idea. Guitars, Cadillacs by Dwight Yoakama also features seen at Terminator 2. Release context: see also a 1991 and film. The summer theatrical season, spanning from mid-May to early September, was expected to witness strong competition among studios. 55 films were slated for release, compared with 37 in 1990. Release dates underwent frequent changes as studios aimed to evade direct competition and optimize their films' chances of success to compensate for the 20% increase in film production costs since 1990. This increase was partly attributed to hefty salaries demanded by stars who also claimed a portion of the film's profits. Moreover, revenues from box office receipts, video sales, and television network deals were on the decline. 104-105A films scheduled for release included City Slickers, The Naked Gun 2, One Half, The Smell of Fear, Only the Lonely, Hudson Hawk, The Rocketeer, What About Bob? And Point Break. Terminator 2 was among the films expected to do well, along with The Backdraft, Dying Young, and the year's predicted top film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. It was also seen as having strong international appeal. An unnamed studio executive said audiences were seeking escapist entertainment such as comedy or action, and avoiding films about less positive subject matter. Marketing and promotion. Schwarzenegger was involved in a Terminator 2 marketing and merchandising campaign, which was estimated to be worth at least $28 million by 1991. Advertising for Terminator 2 was ubiquitous, with high audience recognition despite its U.S.A. raw rating, which restricted the film to audiences aged 17 and over unless accompanied by an adult. Merchandise was mainly aimed at children. TriStar contributed about $28 million for marketing, which included a $150,000 teaser trailer that was directed by Winston and depicts the construction of a T-800. Trailers ran for 6 months before the film's release. TriStar incentivized cinema staff to play it frequently by offering chances to win a Terminator 2 branded goods and tickets to the premiere. Fast food restaurants and soft drink manufacturers, such as Subway and Pepsi, also offered a Terminator 2 themed foodstuffs and drinks, alongside promotional posters. The premiere took place on July 1, 1991, at the Cinéplex Otiona in Century City, Los Angeles. 111-112A. According to Fiedel, it was treated as a major event, unlike the premiere of The Terminator, during which the audience was skeptical or laughed at the wrong times. Celebrities in attendance included Whoopi Goldberg, Billy Crystal, Maria Shriver, Nicolas Cage, Sylvester Stallone, Sharon Stone, Michael Douglas, James Woods, Ice Ta and Furlong's Tai Soleil Moon Frye. Box office. Terminator 2, Judgment Day opened in the United States and Canada on July 3, leading into the Independence Day holiday weekend. It had the highest grossing Wednesday opening with $11.8 million between Friday and Sunday. The film grossed $31.8 million from 2,274 theaters, an average of $13,969 per theater, making it the number one film of the weekend ahead of The Naked Gun 2 A $11.6 million, in its second weekend, and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves $10.3 million, in its fourth over the 5-day holiday weekend, Wednesday to Sunday. Terminator 2 grossed $52.3 million, becoming the second highest opening 5-day total ever behind Batman's $57 million in 1989. It set a record opening for an R-rated film and for an Independence Day weekend. The opening week audience was evenly split between adults, teenagers, and children, about 25%, 30% of whom were women. Although TriStar said the figure was higher. The film benefited from repeat viewings by young audience members. One theater chain executive said: "Ain't nothing since Batman has created the frenzy for tickets we saw this weekend with the Terminator. At virtually all our locations, we are selling out." The word of mouth buzz out there is just phenomenal. Industry professional Lawrence Kasnefa said it was an open secret that despite the R rating, children were seeing the film, remarking, "When T2A opened, I saw kids skateboard up to the ticket window." It retained the number one position in its second weekend, grossing $20.7 million, ahead of the debuts of 101 Dalmatians, $10.3 million, and A Boys in the Hood, $10 million, 128, and in its third weekend with $14.9 million, ahead of Fabulous Bogus Journey, $10.2 million, and A 101 Dalmatians, $7.8 million. 121 Terminator 2, Judgment Day fell to number 2 in its fifth weekend, grossing $8.6 million against the debut of the comedy Hot Shots, $10.8 million. It remained in the top 5 highest grossing films for 12 consecutive weeks and the top 10 highest grossing films for 15 weeks. In total, Terminator 2, Judgment Day spent about 26 weeks in theaters in a total of 2,495 cinemas, and grossed $204.8 million, making it the highest grossing film of the year, ahead of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, $165 million, A Beauty and the Beast, $145 million, and The Silence of the Lambs, $138 million. This also made it the 13th highest grossing film of its time, behind Back to the Future 1985, and the highest grossing R-rated film. The Los Angeles Times estimated after the theater and distributor cuts, the box office returns to Coralco would be well over 20% of the film's cost. Outside the US and Canada, Terminator 2, Judgment Day set numerous box office records. In the United Kingdom, it had a record 3-day opening weekend of $4.4 million, and a 1-week record of $7.8 million, and went on to gross at least $38 million. In France, it grossed a record $9.5 million in its opening week, the biggest opening since Rocky IV, and $16 million in 2 weeks. In Germany, it grossed a record $18 million in 5 days and had a record Australian opening weekend of $1.9 million. In Thailand, it was the highest grossing Western Hemisphere film ever with a gross of $1.2 million. The film also performed well in Brazil and grossed at least $51 million in Japan. Internationally, the film grossed about $312.1 million, making it the first film to gross over $300 million outside of the US and Canada. Terminator 2, Judgment Day is estimated to have grossed a worldwide total of $519.9 million, making it the year's highest grossing film, and the third highest grossing film ever, behind 1977's Star Wars, $538 million. And 1980 Tasa E.T. the Extraterrestrial, $619 million. Reception. Critical response. Terminator 2, Judgment Day was released to critical acclaim. Many reviews focused on the state-of-the-art physical, special, and makeup effects, which were roundly praised as revolutionary and spectacular, particularly those calling the T-1000 a technological wonder. Several publications wrote that Cameron's ability to realize cinematic action blockbusters was unmatched. A Janet Maslina said that at his best, despite occasional lapses into melodrama, Cameron's work is akin to that of director Stanley Kubrick. Both Maslin and the Austin chronically commented on the kindness and compassion in the film. The Austin chronically contrasted it to the lack of a moral message in the Terminator and Travers described it as a visionary parable, but they, alongside others, criticized a Terminator 2's muddled message about protecting the value of human life and peace by using extreme violence to prevent the use of nuclear weapons, war, and technological reliance. Reviewers generally agreed the narrative early in the film is stronger than the one near the end. A.O. and Gleiberman said the first hour has a genuine emotional pull, and according to Roger Ebert, the initial concept of a boy finding a father figure in a Terminator that is learning to be human is intriguing, but Gleiberman said the narrative weakens once Hamilton's character joins the group. Travers and Corliss wrote it stumbles after hours of relentless action and a conventional climax. Despite this observation, Gleiberman praised the final battle between the T-1000 and the protagonists. A Empire's review and Terrence Richa found the film's narrative less satisfying and idea-driven than that of the Terminator. Gleiberman said despite it being an effective and witty thriller, A Terminator 2, Judgment Day comes across as an expensive hobby movie when compared with visionary spectacles such as the Mad Max series and the RoboCop, 1987. A Kenneth Taranis Terminator 2's action scenes succeed without the extreme gore and violence of RoboCop. Ebert and Maslin, among others, appreciated the twist on Schwarzenegger's public action hero persona by making him a hero who does not kill his enemies. A David Ansona and Gleiberman found humor in the T-800's non-lethal methods and efforts to become more human-like. Maslin and Henson agreed that, as Ina the Terminator, Schwarzenegger's role is perfect for his acting abilities. Henson said Schwarzenegger portrayed more humanity as a machine than he did when portraying normal people. In contrast, Empire suggested that the change was a concession to Schwarzenegger's young fans, and Peter Traversa chose the T-800's death as a cornball scene that is out of place for the actor and film. Several reviewers praised the T-1000 character for the combination of Patrick's chilling expressionless performance and the advanced special effects, which create an implacable, show-stopping villain. Empire called the character one of the great monsters of the cinema. Gleiberman said the character's absence from much of the film's second act is to the film's detriment, and Henson wrote that the T-1000 lacks any soul and thus a way for the audience to identify with it. Critics generally agreed Hamilton portrays a fierce female hero with an impressive physique that lets her outshine another action hero, Sigourney Weaver's Ellen Ripley in Cameron's Aliens, 1986. Other publications found Sarah Connor's narrations about peace to be heavy-handed, overused, and unintentionally amusing. A Furlong was praised for giving a natural performance at a young age. And Henson wrote that despite limited screen time, Morton made an impression. Audiences polled by Cinemascoria gave the film a rare average grade of A+ on a scale of A+ to F, making it the only film in the series to receive a grade higher than B+. Accolades. At the 1992 Saturn Awards, A Terminator 2, Judgment Day received awards for a Best Science Fiction Film, a Best Director, James Cameron, a Best Actress, Linda Hamilton, a Best Performance by a Younger Actor, Edward Furlong, and a Best Special Effects, as well as nomination for Best Actor, Arnold Schwarzenegger. It also won Favorite Motion Picture at the 18th People's Choice Awards. For the 45th British Academy Film Awards, A Terminator 2A received awards for a Best Sound, Lee Orlov, A Tom Johnson, A Gary Ridstrom, A Gary Summers, and a Best Special Visual Effects, Stan Winston, A Dennis Muren, A Gene Warren Jr., A Robert Skotak, as well as a nomination for a Best Production Designa, Joseph Nemec III, The 64th Academy Awards earned a Terminator 2 4 awards: a Best Makeup, Winston and Jeff Dawn, a Best Sound, Orlov, Johnson, Redstrom, and Summers, a Best Sound Effects Editing, Redstrom and Gloria S. Borders, and a Best Visual Effects, Murin, Winston, Warren Jr., and Skotak, as well as nominations for a Best Cinematography, Adam Greenberg, and a Best Film Editing, Conrad Buff, a Mark Goldblatt and a Richard A. Harris. It was the first film to win an Academy Award when its predecessor had not been nominated, and received 6 awards at the 1992 MTV Movie Awards, including Best Movie, Best Action Sequence, LA Freeway Scene, Best Breakthrough Performance, Furlong, Best Female Performance, Hamilton, Best Male Performance, Schwarzenegger, and nominations for Best Song from a Movie, You Could Be Mine, Best Villain, Robert Patrick, and Most Desirable Female, Hamilton, 160, as well as a Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, Cameron and a William Wisher Jr., post-release aftermath. Terminator 2, Judgment Day launched the careers or raised the profiles of its principal actors. According to industry professionals, Schwarzenegger became the top international star, ahead of actors such as Mel Gibson and Tom Cruise. It also marked the start of a lasting friendship between Schwarzenegger and Cameron, who formed a midlife crisis motorcycle club and reunited for the action film True Lies, 1994. Cameron and Hamilton began a romantic relationship in 1991, married in 1997, and later divorced. In 1992, Cameron was given a 5-year, $500 million contract by a 20th Century Fox to produce 12 films. Furlong became a highly sought-after actor, and Patrick found dealing with his newfound recognition difficult as people asked him to impersonate the T-1000. Despite the film's success, Carolco reported 1991 losses of $265.18 million, which was caused by the financial problems of its other films and subsidiaries. Support from investors failed to prevent the studio from filing for bankruptcy in 1995, and its assets, including a Terminator 2, were sold to a Canal Plus A for $58 million. Home media. On December 11, 1991, a Terminator 2, Judgment Day was released in OVSA and Laserdisc. It was a popular rental in the US and Canada, with a record 714,000 copies shipped to retailers, and it became the best-selling rental by mid-January 1992. Avar a tilde diaresis se Sarabandia released Fetal's Score, which spent 6 weeks on the Billboard 200-day record chart, peaking at number 70. The theme song You Could Be Mine peaked at number 29 on the U.S.A. Billboard 100, and performed well in the United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, Spain, and Canada. A special edition Laserdisc was released in 1993, featuring a 15-minute extended version of the film that restored deleted scenes, interviews with cast and crew, storyboards, designs, and unrestored deleted scenes. Cameron stated he did not use the label director's cut because he considered the theatrical releases to be definitive and the extended versions as opportunities to restore depth and character made admissible by theatrical running time. 184. The theatrical version was released in OVDA in 1997. In 2000, an Ultimate Edition DVD was released, containing the theatrical and special edition cuts, and a new extended cut, containing a scene of the T-1000 inspecting John's bedroom, and the alternate ending. A Terminator 2 special effects coordinator Irvan Linga supervised the release. 187. The Extreme Edition was released in 2003, featuring the theatrical and special edition cuts, a remastered 1080p image, Cameron's first commentary, and a documentary about the film's influence on special effects. Terminator 2 was released in a Blu-ray in 2006, followed in 2009 by a Skynet edition that contains the theatrical and special edition cuts, and commentaries with the cast and crew. This release includes a limited collector's set containing the Blu-ray, the Ultimate and Extreme editions on DVDs, a digital download version, all extant special features, and a 14-inch, 360mm, T-800 Skull Bust, a 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray. A version that includes a standard Blu-ray and digital version was released in 2017. This release also offered a collector's option that includes one of 6,000 life-size replicas of a T-800 skeleton forearm, each signed by Cameron and individually numbered, the soundtrack, the theatrical, special, extended, and 2017 3D remaster cuts, and Reprogramming the Terminator, a documentary that includes interviews with Schwarzenegger, Cameron, Furlong, and others. Other media. Main articles: A list of Terminator era video games, A list of Terminator era comic books, and a T2 3D, Battle Across Time. Terminator 2, Judgment Day was marketed with numerous tie-in products, including toys, puppets, trading cards, jigsaw puzzles, clothing, a perfume named Hero, and a novelization by Arnold Schwarzenegger that expands on the film's ending in 1991. A Marvel Comics adapted the film into a comic book, which was followed by expansions of the Terminator 2A narrative, including a Malibu Comics' Cybernetic Dawn and Nuclear Twilight, 1995. A 1996, A Dynamite Entertainment's Infinity and Revolution, 2007, and the T2A novel series by S.M. Sterling. In the early 2000s, several video game adaptations of Terminator 2A were published, including a Pinball Machina and an arcade game in 1991. The arcade game was popular enough to be ported to home consoles. Also T2, the arcade game. Multiple studios developed widely differing adaptations for home consoles, including a Terminator 2A for Game Boy and a Terminator 2A for the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES. 194. A later adaptation was developed for the Sega Genesis and a Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and a different game was published for home computers. A merchandise for Terminator 2, Judgment Day was estimated to have generated $400 million in sales by 1997. Another game, A Terminator 2D, No Fate, was released in December 2025. In 1996, A T2 3D, Battle Across Time, a live-action attraction, was opened at Universal Studios Florida, and later at locations in Hollywood and Japan. The 20-minute attraction was co-written and directed by Cameron and cost $68 million to produce, including live-action stunts, and $24 million. 12-minute, 3D film starring Schwarzenegger, Hamilton, Patrick, and Furlong as their enrolled characters, making it the most expensive film per minute produced of its time. In it, Sarah and John attempt to stop Cyberdyne, which has developed Skynet. They are confronted by the T-1000 but saved by the T-800, which returns to 2029 with John to defeat Skynet and its latest creation, the T-1000. 3D Remaster. Main article: A Terminator 2, a 3D remaster. Cameron oversaw a year-long 3D remaster and subsequent theatrical re-release of Terminator 2, Judgment Day in August 2017. Cameron said, "If you've never seen it, this'll be the version you want to see." And remember, Cameron made visual modifications to the film to fix errors that had bothered him, including the addition of windshield glass to the T-1000's truck, which fell out during its stunt fall and reappears in later scenes, concealing the obvious use of stuntmen for Furlong and Schwarzenegger during the same scene, concealed more of Patrick's nudity during his introduction, and brightened the visuals. The 3D remaster's theatrical release was seen as a disappointment, earning about $562,000 in its debut across 386 theaters compared to the 3D re-release of Cameron's Titanica in 2012, which fetched $17 million. Themes and analysis. Themes. A central theme of Terminator 2, Judgment Day is the relationship between John Connor and the T-800, which serves as a surrogate for the father, Kyle Reese. He never knew. Cameron said, "Sure, there's going to be big, thunderous action sequences, but the heart of the movie is that relationship," comparing it to the Tin Man getting a Hartina the Wizard of Oz. As with Cameron's earlier film Aliens, A Terminator 2A focuses on compassion and parental figures, depicting the T-800 as a relentless protector and father figure to John, against the equally relentless T-1000. The T-800 is designed to emulate humans for infiltration purposes, but as it grows and evolves, its emotions become real and it learns from John to feel grief. The T-800 chooses to sacrifice its life to ensure the survival of everyone else. Say in 1991, essayist Robert Bly wrote that older men were not offering suitable role models for young men, and in a Terminator 2, Sarah denounces the many men in her past who failed to be a father for John, except for the T-800. Once its role is complete, the T-800 leaves John for his own good after stating that it lacks the emotions John must rely on. While John teaches the T-800 about humanity, his biological mother Sarah has become less human because of her foreknowledge of the future. Cameron said, "She is a sad character, a tragic character. She believes that everyone she meets, talks to, or interacts with will be dead very soon." This theme of machine-like humans links with Cameron's and Wisher's choice to make the T-1000 appear as a police officer, because thematically they believed it represents humans who should have empathy for others becoming more machine-like and detached from their emotions. The SWAT team at Cyberdyne shoots Dyson, an African-American, without warning. Asinphilia described Dyson as the most human character in the film, an intelligent, optimistic family man who represents real-world encounters between police forces and people of color, in contrast to their encounter with the Caucasian T-800, during which they warn him before opening fire. Following her escape from the state hospital, Sarah appears to embrace John but is actually checking him for injuries, foregoing any emotional attachment for the practicality of ensuring his survival and bringing about his destiny. As a feature leader, the T-800 is portrayed as a better parent than Sarah, offering him undivided attention while Sarah remains distant and focused on the future rather than the present. A philosophy professor Richard T. McClellan notes that Sarah's acceptance of the T-800 as John's surrogate father is such that she leaves it in control of John when she drives away to kill Dyson. Sarah's dream about the nuclear holocaust that will kill 6 billion people, including her son, incites her to kill Dyson before he can complete the work that will bring about Skynet, but when the moment comes, she is unable to fully forsake her humanity and murder him with no emotion. Cameron described this as a question of humanity's worth if we abandon it to win the battle for its existence, in contrast with the bleak, nihilistic themes of the first film. Terminator 2 emphasizes the concept of free will and the value of human life. Schwarzenegger quoted the film's line, "No fate but what we make," saying people have control over their own destinies. Terminator 2 also comments on the use of violence. On its release, reviewers were critical of Terminator 2, Judgment Day's message about preserving peace through violence. Owen Gleiberman stated that reckless indifference to human life is intrinsic to the film, but the T-800 maiming people rather than killing them potentially condemns victims of violence to a life of pain. Cameron described the film as the world's most violent anti-war movie, and said it is about people struggling with their own violent natures. In particular, Cameron had been concerned by the original antagonist T-800's status as a cultural icon and power fantasy as a lethal, unstoppable force of strength and power, and chose to redefine it in Terminator 2, retaining the power fantasy without taking lives. Asinphilia said it is not morally possible to recover from killing people, so Terminator 2 is about redeeming the T-800 and Sarah. Analysis. According to Professor Jeffrey A. Brown, there was a growth of female-led action films in the wake of Aliens' success. Brown believes this reflected the increase in women assuming non-traditional roles and the division between professional critics who perceive a masculinization of the female hero and audiences who embraced characters regardless of gender. The hypermasculine heroes played by Schwarzenegger, Stallone, and Jean-Claude Van Damme were replaced with independent women who are capable of defending themselves and defeating villains in films such as Terminator 2 and The Silence of the Lambs. Brown said these female characters often perform stereotypical male actions and have muscular physiques rather than feminine, soft bodies. He considers Hamilton's undershirt to be symbolic of typically male action heroes such as John McClane and a John Rambo, as well as women displaying masculine traits such as Rachel McLisha in Aces, Iron Eagle IEA, 1992. Despite the emphasis on strong femininity, Hamilton's character remains secondary to Schwarzenegger's. Sayre's efforts to defeat the T-1000 fall short until the last-minute intervention of the T-800. Author Victoria Warren said this allows the female character to be strong enough to be admired but not strong enough to undermine the male protagonist's masculinity. Professors Amanda Fernbach and Thomas B. Byers said the rigid form of the T-800 represents reactionary masculinity that is in direct opposition to the gender-bending T-1000, which represents a postmodern, fluid nature that is outside traditional norms and in opposition to patriarchy and the preservation of the traditional family. Author Mark Duckenfield's Terminator 2, Judgment Day can be seen as an unintended allegory for the decline of United States industries against successful Japanese technology firms, with the cutting-edge T-1000 representing Japan against the older, less advanced T-800. The U.S. industries, which were sometimes seen as villains during the economic boom of the 1980s, are seen as more sympathetic in the face of obsolescence, just as the T-800 is presented as friendlier and still powerful but no longer overwhelmingly so. Duckenfield considers the final scene, which takes place in a steel mill, a place of American industry symbolic. According to Warren, Terminator 2 reflects a Cold War American values that emphasized principles of American culture, in particular individualism and rejection of government intervention. The institutions that the film's protagonists should be able to rely on, such as the government, the police, and technology, are the ones attempting to stop them because they do not believe in the protagonist's doomsday prophecy. Terminator 2, not just creating a sequel, but evolving a classic without compromising its soul. And this is where the conversation always becomes complicated among Terminator fans. Because the moment someone says, "I think Tito is better than the original," somewhere, somebody immediately reacts like a personal boundary has been crossed. And honestly, I understand both perspectives completely because these films are ultimately trying to achieve very different things. The original Terminator is essentially technoer, a stripped down, claustrophobic, a relentlessly tense. You can feel the low-budget urgency in nearly every scene, and strangely enough, that becomes part of the film's identity. Ida feels cold, severe. There's almost no room to breathe. Once the pursuit begins, the movie moves forward with the same mechanical inevitability as the machine itself. Terminator 2 enters the conversation differently. It understands immediately that it's an event film. Larger action, larger emotional stakes, a more ambitious visual effects, expand a mythology. Cameron isn't trying to unsettle audiences in the same way anymore. He's trying to astonish them, and for a massive number of viewers, he absolutely did. There's a reason so many people consider 2 one of the greatest sequels ever made. It expands everything that worked in the original without feeling like a repetition of familiar ideas. The action sequences are more sophisticated. The emotional core is richer. The characters have greater depth, and the technical filmmaking was operating years ahead of much of the industry at the time. At the same time, though, I completely understand why some viewers still prefer the first film because the Terminator possesses a rawness the sequel never really attempts to replicate. It feels dangerous in a distinctly 1980s way. There's no safe net. No overwhelming spectacle softening at the edges. Arnold in that film feels less like a hero and more like death walking calmly through the framing sunglasses. In Tilbo, he becomes something else entirely iconic in a different sense. The film transforms him into a protector, gives him humor, gradually reshapes him into this almost paternal figure for John Connor. Emotionally, it works remarkably well. But it also changes the atmosphere immediately. The T-800 in the original feels unstoppable. In Tito, the audience is meant to celebrate when he appears on screen. That's a massive tonal evolution. Some fans embrace that shift because it gives the sequel a greater emotional weight. Others feel like it softens some of the horror edge that made the original so distinctive. And honestly, Neither perspective is wrong. It really depends on what you value more within the franchise. Do you want the nightmare or do you want the epic? That's essentially the divide. What's impressive is that Cameron somehow made both films feel definitive within their respective genres. The first remains one of the finest science fiction thrillers ever made. The second stands comfortably among the greatest action blockbusters ever produced. Usually when franchises pivot that dramatically in tone, something important gets lost along the way. Here somehow it worked twice. I also think nostalgia plays a major role in this debate. People who experienced it in theaters back in 1991 often describe it less like a movie and more like an event. And honestly, seeing those visual effects at that moment in time must have felt transformative. The T-1000 liquid metal sequences genuinely looked like cinema had advanced overnight. Meanwhile, audiences who gravitate toward the original often connect more deeply with its atmosphere and restraint. There's a grit of confidence to that film. It doesn't rely on giant set pieces every few minutes. It simply locks onto its premise and executes it with precision. And interestingly, the franchise never truly escaped the shadow of those first films. Every sequel afterward feels like it's pursuing one of them, either trying to recreate the horror intensity of the original or imitate the blockbuster scale of Titwo, and none of them entirely capture either experience, which honestly says everything about how special those first two movies really are. Personally, I still go back and forth constantly. Some days I think Titwo is the superior film because technically it's almost astonishing. The pacing, the action choreography, the emotional payoff, the visual effects, it's operating on an extraordinary level of blockbuster craftsmanship. But then I revisit the original Terminator late at night and it affects me in a completely different way. It's rougher, smaller, more confrontational. There's something about that simplicity that lingers long after the movie ends. It settles under your skin in a way that's difficult to replicate. So whenever people debate which film is better, I honestly think the real answer is that Cameron somehow created two classics that complement each other rather than compete with each other. One is the nightmare, the other becomes the myth. One of the most fascinating things about Terminator 2A isn't even the movie itself at times. It's what the film reveals about James Cameron during that stage of his career. Because when you compare the Terminator era in 1984 to Titwo in 1991, you're essentially watching a filmmaker evolve in real time from a relentless, resourceful science fiction director into a full-scale blockbuster architect. And somehow remarkably, he never abandoned the instincts that made him compelling in the first place. That's the impressive part. The first Terminator feels like a film made through sheer determination. Cameron was still proving himself then. The production had limitations everywhere. Budget, technology, scale. But instead of weakening the movie, those restrictions forced precision. Everything had to be efficient, controlled, ruthlessly focused. Then Titwo arrives and suddenly he has resources. Enormous resources. And honestly, when many directors suddenly gain access to major studio support and massive budgets, something often gets diluted. The films become overextended, self-important, or buried beneath empty spectacle. Cameron somehow moved in the opposite direction. He'd get the things he already understood, pacing, tension, mechanical precision, action choreography, and elevated the aim to an extraordinary scale. Tito feels like someone finally handed him the tools to build the movie he'd probably been imagining for years. And what's remarkable is that he was doing these before modern CGI filmmaking fully existed in the form audiences recognize it today. People sometimes forget how risky Terminator 2 actually was at the time. This wasn't simply another sequel designed to capitalize on a recognizable title. Cameron was committing enormous resources to visual effects technology that barely existed yet. The liquid metal T-1000 wasn't something a studio could casually generate in a few weeks. Entire techniques had to be developed specifically for the film. When you think about it now, that level of ambition is genuinely extraordinary. And honestly, it fits Cameron perfectly because his entire career feels driven by this obsession with pushing a technology to the point where everyone around him starts questioning whether it can even work. You can already see the blueprint for the rest of his career inside Titwo. The scale, the technical ambition, the perfectionism, Even Thea's stories surrounding the production already sound unmistakably like James Cameron's stories. Massive budgets, production delays, technical obstacles that seemed impossible to solve, industry skepticism about whether the entire thing was becoming unmanageable. Then the movie arrives and reshapes the industry. Anyway, that became part of his legacy for years afterward. People questioning whether the scale was sustainable. Then Cameron delivering something that completely dominates popular culture regardless. He would repeat that cycle later with Titanic, then again with Avatar. But it feels like the exact moment Hollywood fully realized this wasn't simply a talented director anymore. This was becoming the blockbuster filmmaker of an entire era. And honestly, what I appreciate most revisiting Tito now is that beneath all of the technology and financial scale, Cameron still directs action like a suspense filmmaker. That matters. A load of large-scale modern action films feel overwhelming but strangely weightless. Constant destruction, constant movement, yet no rhythm holding any of it together. Cameron understands build-up. He understands spatial geography before real chaos begins. He knows when to slow a momentum down, when to accelerate, when to hold on a reaction shot just long enough to increase tension. The Malice sequence is a perfect example of that discipline. The tension therein built purely through spectacle. It comes from uncertainty. The audience understands danger is approaching, but Cameron carefully controls movement, perspective, and information until everything collides at once. That's a filmmaking craft, pure and simple, and honestly, Cameron's confidence behind the camera in Tito is extraordinary. The movie is enormous in scale, yet it never feels disorganized. Even during the most ambitious action scenes, you always understand where characters are positioned, what they're trying to achieve, and why the moment matters emotionally. That sounds simple on paper, but it really isn't. Especially now. There's also something deeply characteristic of Cameron in the way the film becomes emotional beneath all the machinery. He's often described as a cold, technical filmmaker because of the effects, the engineering, the spectacle. But when his films work best, they surprisingly emotional experiences. Sarah Connor's trauma, John slowly bonding with the T-800, the looming fear of nuclear annihilation, even the gradual suggestion that a machine can begin to understand human emotion. Those ideas genuinely matter to him. He doesn't simply construct action scenes. He builds emotional payoff directly into the action itself. And you can feel Cameron becoming more ambitious as a storyteller, too. The original Terminator is laser-focused survival horror. Tito begins engaging with the larger ideas, fate, artificial intelligence, free will, whether the future can actually be changed. It still moves with the propulsion of an action film, but there's more happening beneath the surface. Now, at the same time, you can also see the beginnings of Cameron's larger scale instincts emerging more aggressively. He loves escalation, loves an expanding scale. At moments, Tito almost feels determined to surpass itself every 20 minutes. Larger explosions, more elaborate chases, a greater destruction. But honestly, the film earns it because Cameron never treats spectacle as empty noise. He treats it as payoff. Everything is carefully engineered toward giving the audience a feeling of escalation without sacrificing the emotional foundation underneath it. That balance is precisely why Tito still feels effective. While so many giant blockbusters from that era now feel hollow or overly mechanical, watching it today, you're not simply seeing a great sequel, you're watching at the exact moment James Cameron fully transforms into the filmmaker who would dominate blockbuster cinema for decades afterward. And somehow, despite all of the money, all the technology, all the studio pressure, the movie still feels made by the same person who directed that grimy little science fiction nightmare back in 1984. Just with much larger tools at his disposal. One thing that becomes immediately apparent watching Terminator 2 after the original is how dramatically the scale expands, not just visually, though obviously the budget increased enormously, but the entire world of the franchise suddenly feels larger. The first Terminator was essentially survival horror unfolding across city streets, dark alleys, police stations, nightclubs, factories. The movie felt confined in a very effective way, tight, suffocating, Like the walls that were gradually closing in around Sarah Connor. Chua dismantles those walls almost immediately. Suddenly, the franchise has scope, wide highways stretching into the distance, massive industrial complexes, helicopters flying beneath bridges, entire SWAT teams mobilizing, explosions unfolding on a scale the original film could never approach, futuristic war imagery with the tanks crushing skulls beneath red skies. Cameron isn't simply making a chase film anymore, he's constructing an apocalyptic blockbuster. And honestly, you can feel every dollar on screen. At the time, this was one of the most expensive films ever produced, and unlike some large-scale productions where you constantly sense the money being spent, Tadwo transforms that scale into atmosphere. The movie feels enormous without feeling artificial. That's an incredibly difficult balance to achieve because larger budgets can absolutely damage sequels, especially sequels to films that work precisely because of their simplicity. A lot of franchises lose their identity the moment studios start writing larger checks. Suddenly everything becomes louder, shinier, more excessive, more spectacle, less tension. But Cameron understood something essential here: suspense, emotional depth, humor, spectacle. There's a little of everything inside it. What's interesting though is that beneath the larger blockbuster energy, the film remains surprisingly dark when you really examine it. Sarah Connor is psychologically shattered. Judgment Day is still approaching. The future war imagery remains horrifying. There's literally a nuclear nightmare sequence where children are vaporized beside a playground. So even though Tadwo is undeniably more crowd-pleasing than the original, Cameron never fully softens the core themes. The apocalypse still hangs over the entire story like a shadow the characters can't escape. I think that's part of why the emotional moments land so effectively. 2. The first movie keeps the audience tense. Tito actually allows the audience to care. The relationship between John and the T-800 gives the film a warmth that the original intentionally avoided. Suddenly, there are quieter scenes, conversations, small moments of humor, characters learning from one another. The movie slows down just enough for emotional connection before throwing everyone back into chaos again. And honestly, attempting that tonal balance in a sequel like this is dangerous because it could have become sentimental very easily. Some people still feel certain moments lean too heavily into emotion compared to the brutal simplicity of the first film. And I understand that criticism. The original possessed this relentless purity. Tito absolutely wants the audience to leave emotionally fulfilled in a way the first movie never attempted. But honestly, to argue that tonal evolution is exactly why the sequel became iconic. Cameron understood he couldn't simply remake the original. If Arnold remained the antagonist and the sequel repeated the same horror thriller structure beat for beat, audiences probably would have enjoyed it, but I don't think the film would still dominate conversations decades later in the same way. Instead, Cameron expanded the emotional range of the franchise. The movie can move from attention to humor to genuine emotional resonance within the same sequence and somehow never feel tonally unstable. That's incredibly difficult to achieve. Most action films either become overwhelmingly self-serious or disappear into constant jokes. Ta exists somewhere between those extremes. Even visually, the tone evolves. The first movie feels claustrophobic and grimy. 2 feels wider, brighter, more cinematic. Not necessarily safer, just a larger, more mythic. The apocalypse story is no longer unfolding quietly in dark corners. It's expanding into the open world now. And honestly, I think the tonal flexibility is one of the reasons the movie has aged so gracefully. It isn't trapped inside a single emotional register. You can revisit it for the action or the suspense or the emotional ending or simply to watch Arnold operating at Becca movie star presence. The film constantly shifts energy without losing momentum. That's really the impressive achievement. Chua evolves from horror into epic science fiction action without betraying what made the original meaningful in the first place. It still feels like the same universe, the same fear, the same looming inevitability, just viewed through a much broader emotional lens. The nightmare never disappeared. It simply learned how to entertain you while it was chasing you. What James Cameron accomplishes with the Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator 2 is honestly one of the smartest character pivots in blockbuster history. because you think about where Arnold existed before this film. In the original Terminator, he's essentially cinematic death. No empathy, no emotional warmth, just these unstoppable machine advancing forward while everyone around him collapses into a panic. At times, he barely even feels like a traditional character, more like a force of nature wearing sunglasses. And audiences love that version of him. So naturally, the safest creative choice for the sequel would have been simple: more of that. Larger body counts, bigger action, turn Arnold into an even more intimidating monster. Instead, Cameron completely reverses the dynamic. Now the Terminator is protecting people. That's such a risky decision, because the moment you transform the machine into the hero, you risk losing the very thing that made him intimidating in the first place. But somehow Titwo makes it work, because the film never pretends the T-800 suddenly became human. He's still emotionally disconnected, still awkward, still intensely literal. The difference is that now we're experiencing those qualities from the inside rather than at the outside. And strangely enough, that makes him deeply likable. What's brilliant is how gradually Cameron shifts audience perception without fundamentally changing who the Terminator actually is. The machine still speaks the same way, still moves with that rigid precision, still approaches situations through pure logic. But now those qualities generate humor instead of fear. The deadpan delivery becomes entertaining, the stiffness becomes oddly charming. Arnold walking through human society while clearly not fully understanding humanity gives the film so much personality. And honestly, nobody else could have played this role the way Schwarzenegger did. That probably sounds obvious now because the performance became iconic. But there's a real reason for that. Arnold's limitations as an actor somehow became his strengths within the character. The accent, the rigid delivery, the slightly unnatural cadence in certain linear readings, all of it fits perfectly because he's literally portraying a machine attempting to imitate human behavior. It's one of those rare casting choices that feels almost inevitable in retrospect, like the actor and the role were somehow designed for each other long before the cameras even started rolling. And by the time Titwo arrives, the film fully understands Arnold Schwarzenegger's screen presence. The biker bar entrance alone communicates everything. Cameron frames him like a mythology brought to life. The boots, the leather jacket, the sunglasses, the shotgun spin. None of it is subtle, but the subtlety isn't really the point. By the early 1990s, Arnold had evolved into something larger than a traditional movie star. He'd become an icon. Ju-ah embraces that completely. But underneath all the style and spectacle, there's an actual character progression happening. And honestly, I think that's the part that people sometimes overlook. The Terminator's evolution isn't emotional in the conventional sense. He doesn't suddenly develop feelings like a sentimental science fiction cliché. Instead, he learns through observation. John teaches him language, reactions, boundaries, behavior. The machine gradually begins understanding humanity piece by piece without ever fully becoming human itself. That's why moments like, "Why do you cry?" actually land emotionally, because the movie earns them slowly. At the beginning, the T-800 is simply executing instructions. Protect John Connor. Complete the mission. Nothing more. But gradually, the dynamic begins to shift. John stops viewing him purely as a protection and starts seeing him as something much closer to the father figure he never truly had. And honestly, that relationship becomes the emotional foundation of the entire film. The Terminator turns into this strange combination of bodyguard, mentor, older brother, and parent. He's the only presence in Jay's life that feels completely dependable, completely present. He won't abandon him, won't betray him, won't disappear. And when you really think about that, it's kinda of heartbreaking, especially because the machine itself can't fully comprehend why that bond matters so deeply to John. There's also a fascinating contrast between Arnold's role across the two films. In the original movie, he represented inevitability, pure unstoppable destruction. In Titwo, he becomes resistance against inevitability, the force standing between humanity and extinction. Samia face, completely different emotional meaning, and Schwarzenegger handles that balance remarkably well. He never pushes the comedy too far, never allows the character to collapse into self-parody. Even the famous one-liners work because he delivers them with absolute seriousness. That deadpan confidence became a massive part of why the performance embedded itself into pop culture permanently. "I'll be back, hasta la vista, baby." On paper, those lines could sound absurd coming from almost anyone else. Arnold somehow turns the Emma into mythology. At the same time, though, the film never completely removes the danger from him either. There are still moments reminding you that this machine was created for violence. Sarah Connor especially never fully trusts him at first. And honestly, why would she? She's staring at the Samia face that destroyed her life years earlier. That lingering discomfort gives us the transformation additional depth. The Terminator becoming heroic doesn't erase what he once represented. The movie continually reminds the audience that beneath the protective programming is still a machine engineered to eliminate targets. John teaching him not to take lives becomes important because morality literally has to be taught to him. And by the end of the film, the T-800's final decision becomes surprisingly emotional. Not because he suddenly became human, but because he evolved just enough to understand a sacrifice. That's what makes the ending resonate. You realized somewhere along the way, this giant mechanical figure who originally entered cinema as one of its great nightmares quietly became the emotional center of the story without the audience fully noticing the transition happening. Which honestly shouldn't work. But Tito handles it so naturally that now it's impossible to imagine the franchise evolving any other way. Arnold didn't simply return for the sequel. He transformed one of cinema's great monsters into one of its great heroes. One of the reasons Terminator 2 lands emotionally harder than people sometimes expect is because beneath all of the explosions and machine gun fire, it's secretly a story about a lonely child discovering the closest thing he hasn't ever had to a father figure, which sounds completely absurd when you remember that the father figure in question is a 7-foot Austrian machine from the future capable of punching through steel doors. But somehow it works, and not in a forced Hollywood way either. The relationship between John Connor and the T-800 develops so naturally over the course of the film that eventually you stop questioning how strange the premise actually is. When we first meet John, he's basically living inside instability. Foster homes, no real structure, a mother institutionalized while warning everyone that the apocalypse is coming. He's intelligent, rebellious, sarcastic, defensive, and honestly, you can tell he's trying very hard to appear tougher than he actually feels. That's one of the things I've always appreciated about Edward Furlong's performance. Now, admittedly, audiences have always been divided on him. Some viewers find him loud, irritating, aggressively representative of early 90s teenager energy. And yes, occasionally, he absolutely sounds like a kid who discovered slang about 10 minutes earlier. But strangely, that awkwardness makes the character feel authentic to me because John Connor at this stage isn't the legendary resistance leader yet. He's just a child, a confused child raised on paranoia, survival training, and stories about the end of the world before he was even old enough to fully understand what any of it meant. Sarah trained him to prepare for humanity's collapse while he was still growing up. So, there's this constant tension inside him, part normal teenager, part future military commander. And then the Terminator arrives. At first, John almost treats the T-800 like this incredible weapon he suddenly controls. There's excitement in those early scenes when he realizes he can literally give orders to a Terminator. But gradually the relationship deepens into something more meaningful. The machine listens to him, protects him, remains beside him. That last part matters most because when you really examine Jay's life, nearly every adult around him has failed him in some way. Foster parents don't understand him, authority figures dismiss him. His mother loves him deeply, but her trauma has made their relationship emotionally overwhelming and unstable. Sarah is preparing him to save humanity, but she isn't giving him anything remotely close to a normal childhood. Then this machine arrives and ironically becomes the most stable presence in his life. In the movie, Isa intelligent enough not to oversell any of it emotionally. That restraint Isa exactly why it works. Cameron doesn't pause the narrative every few scenes to announce, look, they're bonding now. How the relationship develops gradually through small moments, John teaching Thea Terminator slang, the awkward high-five he attempts, explaining why humans cry, teaching him not to eliminate people. Those scenes matter because they slowly transform the T-800 from a weapon into an emotional anchor for John. What's fascinating is that the relationship changes both of them. John becomes more irresponsible because he slowly realizes that the stakes are real. Meanwhile, the Terminator begins adapting to human behavior in ways that extend beyond pure emission programming. Not emotionally in a traditional sense, but behaviorally. He learns through observation, through a John. And honestly, some of the film's funniest moments emerge directly from that dynamic. The T-800 trying to function socially is hilarious precisely because he's so terrible at it. Arnold plays those scenes with complete sincerity, which makes them even better. The machine repeating phrases like he is someone learning humanity from scratch becomes both funny and strangely touching at the same time. But the movie never allows you to forget the sadness underneath it all, because John is ultimately bonding with something that technically isn't alive. There's this quiet tragedy running beneath the entire relationship where the Terminator can protect John physically, but he can never fully become what John emotionally needs him to be. He can imitate care, learn a behavior, understand purpose, but there's always a barrier separating the imitation from genuine humanity. And somehow that limitation makes the connection feel even more emotional. The scene that always stays with me into even one of the massive action set pieces. It's the moment John realizes the Terminator would never abandon him, never disappear, never fail him in the ways real people often do. He says the machine would make a better father than most actual men. That line lands incredibly hard because suddenly you understand just how damaged this kid's world really is. The movie also smartly contrasts John's relationship with the Terminator against Sarah's relationship with it. Sarah sees the machine as a reminder of terror. John sees it as a safety. She fears it instinctively. He trusts it completely. That divide creates some of the strongest emotional tension in the middle portion of the film. And by the end, honestly, the finale works almost entirely because of that father-son dynamic. If the movie hadn't spent so much time carefully building their relationship, the final sacrifice wouldn't carry nearly the same emotional impact. But because the audience watched John gradually connect with this machine throughout the story, the goodbye suddenly becomes devastating in a way you don't necessarily expect from a science fiction action blockbuster, especially because the Terminator himself still doesn't fully understand human emotion. He isn't crying, he isn't becoming sentimental, but he understands enough now to recognize why his existence is dangerous and why John is hurting. That's the brilliance of it. The film never turns the T-800 into a human being. It simply allows him to become deeply important to one. Honestly, I think one of the biggest reasons Terminator 2A still feels emotionally powerful today is Sarah Connor. Not the action scenes, not the visual effects, not even Arnold, as iconic as he is, Sarah Connor. Because when you really examine the film, she's the emotional center holding everything together. And what Linda Hamilton accomplishes with that character is genuinely remarkable when compared to where Sarah began in the original movie. In The Terminator, Sarah is essentially ordinary. That's what made her relatable. She's a waitress suddenly thrown into an impossibly nightmare. The movie forces her to evolve in real time just to survive. But Titwa returns years later and asks a much more uncomfortable question. What would surviving something like that actually do to a person? And the answer the film gives is complicated. It damages her. That's what I love about Sarah Connor in this sequel. Cameron doesn't transform her into some polished action hero fantasy. He turns her into someone shaped by trauma, hardened by it, consumed by it. She's paranoid, emotionally isolated, exhausted, a constantly alert. She spent years preparing for an apocalypse nobody believes is coming while the entire world treats her as unstable. And from a society's perspective, she probably does appear unstable. That's the tragedy of the character. The audience knows she's right, but everyone around her sees a woman obsessively talking about machines, nuclear annihilation, Judgment Day, and the collapse of civilization itself. So, she's institutionalized, medicated, dismissed, restrained. There's something deeply frustrating about watching that because we understand she's carrying the weight of humanity's future almost entirely alone. Linda Hamilton plays all of it with this intensity that still feels unmatched in a lot of action cinema. She never enters a scenes trying to appear effortlessly cool. Sarah Connor in Tito looks exhausted, wounded, hypervigilant. Even when she's standing still, there's a tension in her body like she's expecting a catastrophe at any moment. And physically, the transformation is startling the first time you see it. The vulnerable waitress from the original film is gone. Now she's muscular, scarred, disciplined, almost military in the way she moves. You can tell this is someone who has spent years preparing for war before the war even began. But what makes Hamilton's performance exceptional is that she never allows Sarah to become emotionally hollow. Beneath all the toughness, there's still a fear, still grief, still guilt, especially when it comes to John. That relationship is incredibly complicated until and I'm glad the movie never simplifies it. Sarah loves her son completely, but her fear of the future has consumed her life so thoroughly that she struggles to simply be his mother. She's raising him to survive the apocalypse, not to experience childhood. And you can feel the emotional damage that created. John respects her, but has frightened by her sometimes, too. There's emotional distance between them. Exhaustion. Sarah is so focused in preparing him to become humanity's future leader that she unintentionally denies him the opportunity to simply be a kid. And honestly, the film is fully aware of that tragedy. That's why her scenes resonate more deeply than a typical strong female action hero performance. Sarah isn't strong because the script declares her strong. She's strong because survival forced her into becoming that person. There's a huge difference. I also think people forget how groundbreaking this character felt at the time. Modern Hollywood constantly talks about powerful female protagonists, but Sarah Connor in Tidwell still feels more authentic than many modern examples because the movie actually understands the psychological cost attached to that strength. Her resilience is inseparable from her trauma. There's this incredibly contradiction within the character where she's probably the toughest person in the entire movie and also one of the saddest. The nightmare sequence alone communicates everything happening inside her mentally. Watching the playground erupt in nuclear fire while children are consumed in front of her as she screams helplessly behind the fence. That scene isn't simply spectacle. It's Sarah living with apocalypse inside her mind every single day. That fear drives everything she does. And then there's the Dyson sequence. Honestly, one of the strongest scenes in the film because that's the moment Sarah almost crosses a line she can't emotionally return from. She becomes so consumed by preventing a judgment day that she's willing to eliminate a man in front of his family if it means stopping the future from happening. And the movie doesn't frame it as some triumphant action moment either. It's disturbing, painful. You can watch her emotionally unravel while trying to convince herself it's necessary. That's what makes Sarah such a fascinating character. She's trying to save humanity while gradually losing a part of her own humanity in the process. At the same time though, the movie quietly positions her as the true hero of the franchise, not because she's physically unstoppable, but because she refuses to surrender to inevitability. Everyone else either ignores the future or accepts it. Sarah fights against Ida constantly, even when it destroys her personal life along the way. And honestly, without Linda Hamilton fully committing to the emotional reality of that trauma, Titwa probably doesn't work nearly as well as it does, because beneath all the spectacle, Sarah Connor grounds the story emotionally. She reminds the audience that Judgment Day isn't just an interesting science fiction concept. It represents the potential loss of billions of lives, families, children, entire cities erased in moments. She carries that knowledge every second of the movie, and by the end, What truly makes Sarah Connor iconic isn't simply that she's tough, it's that she's terrified and keeps moving forward. Anyway, the smartest thing Terminator 2 does with its antagonist is realizing there's absolutely no point trying to out-Arnold Schwarzenegger. You can't simply introduce another massive machine and expect it to feel more intimidating than the original Terminator. The first movie already perfected that approach. So, instead of going physically larger, Cameron moves in the complete opposite direction, and that's exactly why the T-1000 works so brilliantly. Robert Patrick's Terminator feels so terrifying because he feels evolved, cleaner, faster, colder, less like a machine engineered for war, and more like something specifically designed for a pursuit. Arnold's T-800 in the original film was essentially a walking tank. Heavy footsteps, mechanical force, pure brute strength, crashing through walls and tearing through obstacles. The T-1000 barely appears to exert effort at all. He moves with this eerie fluidity that feels unnatural even before the liquid metal abilities fully reveal themselves. There's something deeply unsettling about how calm he is. That's always the detail that stays with me revisiting the film. Robert Patrick never overplays the role. No dramatic monologues, no theatrical villainous speeches. Half the time he's simply staring at people with this blank expression like he's already calculated exactly how their lives end. And in honestly disguising him as a police officer is a brilliant creative decision. Cameron takes this futuristic nightmare machine and wraps it in the image of everyday authority. A police officer is supposed to symbolize safety, structure, reassurance. The T-1000 twists that familiarity into something predatory. Every time he calmly walks into a room asking questions, there's a tension beneath the scene because the audience understands what he truly is. And Robert Patrick sells that perfectly. There's this incredible physical precision to his performance throughout the entire movie, especially the way he runs. It doesn't even look fully human, and no wasted motion, no visible exhaustion. Just relentless, forward momentum. Apparently, Patrick trained himself to breathe only through his nose during the running scenes, so he would appear more machine-like on screen. And honestly, it absolutely worked. The man moves like he is software, occupying a human body. Then you layer the liquid metal abilities and on top of that and suddenly the protagonists are dealing with something that barely obeys normal physical rules anymore. That's what makes the T-1000 feel so intimidating compared to many blockbuster antagonists. You genuinely don't know how the hero's area is supposed to stop him. Bullets barely matter. Explosions barely matter. He gets frozen, shattered into fragments, then calmly reforms as if reality itself only mildly inconvenienced him. And the remarkable thing is that the visual effects still hold up largely because the underlying concept is so elegant. Liquid metal shapeshifting mimicking people. Cameron doesn't drown the audience in endless scientific jargon or overcomplicated explanations. He presents the idea visually and trusts the viewers to immediately understand why it's terrifying. There's also this almost ghost-like quality to the T-1000. Arnold's Terminator feels so mechanical and physical. You can imagine the gears, pistons, hydraulics underneath the skin. The T-1000 almost feels supernatural at times, passing through bars, reforming through prison gates, changing shape effortlessly. In certain moments, he feels less like a robot and more like a nightmare adapting itself in real time. That contrast between the two Terminators is what creates so much of the film's tension. The T-800 suddenly feels outdated, still powerful, absolutely, but older technology, slower, less advanced, and the movie constantly reinforces that imbalance. The T-1000 recovers faster, moves faster, adapts faster. It represents a evolution overtaking older machinery. And interestingly, because Arnold's Terminator becomes more humanized in it, the T-1000 inherits much of the cold terror associated with the original film. He becomes the nightmare. Now, there's one moment in particular that always stays with me. When Sarah Connor escapes the hospital, turns the corner expecting freedom, and suddenly sees Arnold standing there. For a split second, she believes the horror from the first movie has returned. Then, the T-1000 appears behind her, And both Sarah and the audience realize that there's something even worse pursuing them now. That scene perfectly defines the villain dynamic in Titwo. I also love how restrained the T-1000 remains throughout the film. A lot of blockbuster villains eventually become overly talkative or theatrical. The T-1000 barely needs dialogue because the threat already speaks for itself. Robert Patrick plays him with this chilling control where even small gestures feel dangerous. And when he imitates politeness or emotion, Ida somehow becomes even more unsettling. The cockpit voices, the artificial friendliness, the faint smiles that never quite feel natural. It's like watching something study human behavior academically without ever truly understanding humanity itself. At the same time, Cameron also uses the T-1000 to deepen the movie's larger themes. The T-800 is gradually learning about humanity, while the T-1000 remains completely detached from it. One machine slowly develops a understanding, the other remains pure function. Pure mission. Eliminate John Connor. Nothing else matters. And honestly, part of why the T-1000 became such an iconic antagonist is because the movie never weakens him simply to make the heroes appear stronger. He dominates most encounters. Huge portions of the film are built around the protagonist desperately trying to survive him. Even when the T-800 fights back, it often feels less like victory and more like a temporary resistance. That imbalance keeps the tension alive all the while through the story because deep down the audience keeps asking the same question. How do you even stop this thing? By the time the steel mill climax arrives, the T-1000 has essentially transformed into this melting unstable embodiment of unstoppable technological horror. And even then, the movie extracts every final ounce of fear from him before the conclusion, which is why Roberta Patrick's performance still stands as one of the great science fiction villains. Not because he's loud, not because he's flashy, because he feels inevitable. One thing I think Terminator 2 deserves far more credit for is how effectively it handles the ordinary people surrounding all the chaos, because it would have been very easy for the movie to become nothing but Arnold vs. Liquid Metal Robot for 2 and 1/2 hours. And honestly, with action seen as this strong, audiences probably still would have enjoyed themselves immensely. But Cameron constantly grounds the story through ordinary human beings who make the apocalypse feel emotionally real. That matters. A lot of large-scale science fiction films talk endlessly about saving humanity, but you rarely feel actual humanity inside them. Characters announce that the world is in a danger while explosions happen in the background. 2 works differently because it continually shows how these massive future stakes affect real people. The best example of that is Miles Dyson. Honestly, Joe Morton is kind of the secret weapon of the movie's second half. Because when Sarah first talks about Dyson, the film frames him almost like a villain before we ever meet him. This brilliant engineer unknowingly creating the technology that will eventually destroy civilization. In Sarah's mind, he is essentially responsible for billions of future deaths. Then the movie introduces him and he's just a person, a husband, a father, a normal man working in a technology he doesn't fully understand yet. That's what makes the cyberdynia sequences so emotionally effective. Dyson isn't malicious. He isn't some power-obsessed scientist trying to bring about humanity's downfall. He's actually a warm, intelligent, likable. You watch him joking with his family, living an ordinary life, completely unaware that his research eventually contributes to a judgment day. And suddenly the movie becomes morally more complicated because Sarah Connor has spent years imagining this almost mythological enemy in her mind. But when she finally confronts him, reality collides with her fear. She's staring at an innocent man with a family, not a monster. That scene where she nearly takes his life is one of the most uncomfortable moments in the film for exactly that reason. You can feel how deeply trauma has distorted her thinking. She's trying to save the future, but she's also terrifying a wife and child in the process. and Joe Mortona handles Dyson's realization beautifully. He doesn't suddenly transform into an action hero. He reacts like an actual human being trying to process impossibly information all at once. That human reaction matters because it reminds you that Terminator 2 isn't really about a machines conquering the world. It's about human beings accidentally creating a something beyond their ability to control. Even the smaller supporting characters reinforce that feeling. The foster parents aren't deeply explored or anything, but they help establish that John's life was already unstable long before the Terminators returned. The hospital staff surrounding Sarah Connor add another layer, too, because from their perspective, she genuinely appears so dangerous and delusional. They have no idea they're trapped inside the middle of a science fiction apocalypse narrative. And honestly, that's one of Cameron's greatest strengths as a filmmaker in general. He gives side characters just enough personality and a humanity that the world feels inhabited by actual people instead of disposably background figures waiting for explosions. Even tiny moments linger in your memory, the nervous security guard, the scientists panicking during the Cyberdine assault, the terrified reactions during the truck pursuit. The movie constantly reminds you that ordinary people are caught in the middle of this future war chaos, whether they understand it or not. And that's part of what gives the stakes genuine emotional weight. Because Judgment Day is never treated like some abstract cool sci-fi concept, the film continually brings it back to families, children, civilians, everyday routines. The nuclear nightmare sequence works because Cameron focuses on playgrounds, parents, and ordinary life being erased instantly. The apocalypse feels personal. That's also why Dyson's sacrifice lands emotionally. By the time he chooses to help destroy his own work, the audience fully understands what's at stake through him. He becomes this symbol of humanity, attempting to correct its own mistakes before it's too late. And honestly, I think it becomes a much smarter film because of characters like him. Without those human elements, the movie probably still succeeds as a spectacular action experience. But with them, the story gains moral tension, consequence. Suddenly, the future war isn't simply about machines and destruction anymore. It becomes about responsibility. Who creates dangerous technology? Who controls it? Who suffers when things spiral beyond control? The movie never overexplains those ideas, but they're sitting quietly beneath the surface the entire time. And honestly, I think that's part of why the emotional stakes still resonate decades later, because beneath all the chrome, fire, and gunfire, Terminator 2 constantly reminds you what the characters are actually fighting for. Not victory, not glory, just the chance for ordinary people to continue living ordinary lives. It's honestly difficult to fully explain to modern audiences just how overwhelming the effects in Terminator 2 felt back in 1991, because now we live in an era where viewers see massive digital cities collapsing every other weekend, superheroes fly through dimensional portals, entire planets explode, actors are digitally degged by computers. GI exists everywhere now, sometimes to the point where audiences barely consciously register it anymore. But it arrived during this strange moment where digital effects still felt almost magical, actual magic. And James Cameron understood exactly how to use that feeling. The T-1000 wasn't simply another creature with impressive makeup or animatronics attached to it. These thing transformed, melted, walked through metal bars, reassembled itself after being shattered apart, became other people. Audiences in 1991 genuinely had never seen anything like it before. The liquid metal effects hit people like a shockwave. Even now, revisiting the movie decades later, some of those sequences still carry these uncanny quality. The famous checkered floor shot, the silver metal reforming itself, the blade arms emerging without a warning. There's a simplicity to the visual concept that gives it a timeless power. And honestly, I think a part of why the effects have aged so gracefully is because Cameron never relied on CGI alone. That's something people sometimes forget. To end drowning in digital effects from beginning to end. The film uses them strategically. Cameron combines CGI with the practical effects, miniatures, prosthetics, stunt work, puppetry. All of this traditional filmmaking, a craftsmanship working together alongside a brand new technology. That combination is what gives the movie weight. Stan Winston's practical effects work especially deserves far more recognition than it usually gets. Their area sequences audiences assume are entirely computer generated that were actually achieved using physical models and incredibly detailed practical setups. The T-1000 splitting apart, a damaged face is reforming, metallic wounds opening across the body. So much of that involved practical artistry layered carefully together with digital enhancement, and because real physical objects existed on set, the effects feel connected to the environment around them. That's why the movie still holds up. While some CGI-heavy films from the same era feel noticeably dated now, Cameron wasn't trying to replace reality with computers. He was using computers to extend reality. That's a huge difference. Industrial light and magic completely changed the game here, too. The work they accomplished in Tidwell helped redefine what Hollywood believed it was technologically possible. You can draw a direct line from the T-1008 to the explosion of digital filmmaking throughout the rest of the decade. Honestly, the movie opened the floodgates. After Tidwell, studios realized computers could create imagery audiences had literally never seen before. You start watching CGI evolve rapidly throughout the 1990s because this film proved the technology could genuinely support mainstream blockbuster storytelling instead of existing purely as a novelty. But what I really appreciate revisiting Tito now is how disciplined Cameron remains with the effects. He doesn't constantly show off. The T-1000's abilities appear when they serve tension, surprise, or horror. Cameron understands restraint. Sometimes the most impressive part of an effect isn't the effect itself, it's the build-up before it happens. Take the hospital floor sequence. The movie doesn't immediately announce itself with a look what CGI can do. Instead, it quietly allows the T-1000 to emerge through the bars, and your brain takes a second to fully process what you're seeing. That slight delay makes the moment even more unsettling. And weirdly, some modern CGI-heavy blockbusters actually feel less believable than two because they overwhelm the audience non-stop. Cameron gives the effects room to breathe. The practical action sequences help enormously, too. The truck pursuits, the explosions, the helicopter stunts, the motorcycle sequences. So much of the film exists physically in the real world that when the digital moments arrive, they feel grounded inside tangibly environments. Your brain accepts the impossible more easily because everything surrounding it already feels surreal. There's also something incredibly elegant about the design philosophy behind the T-1000 itself. The effects are visually complex but conceptually simple. Liquid metal. That's it. You immediately understand the danger without requiring endless exposition. Cameron doesn't bury the audience beneath technical explanations about futuristic molecular systems or nanotechnology jargon. He trusts visual storytelling completely. And honestly, some of the effects still look better than modern blockbusters operating with exponentially more computing power, partly because Cameron was obsessive about lighting and physical integration. The reflections, shadows, and movement of the T-1000 actually interact correctly with the environment around him. Even today, that attention to detail matters far more than raw graphical complexity. And the movie always understands when to make the effects disturbing instead of merely impressive. The fingers becoming blades, the copied identities, the way the T-1000 reforms after damage, as if pain means absolutely nothing to it. Those moments still work because they retied directly to suspense and fear rather than spectacle alone. That's the real genius behind T2's visual effects work. It isn't technology existing purely for the sake of technology. Every visual breakthrough strengthens the story, the tension, or the atmosphere. The effects never exist separately from the movie itself. They are part of the movie's emotional language. The T-1000 literally could not function as a villain without them. And honestly, that's why Terminator 2 still feels so revolutionary even now. Not because it was simply an early CGI film, because it was one of the first major blockbusters to fully understand how digital effects could emotionally affect an audience instead of merely impressing them technically. The technology changed cinema, but the filmmaking is what made it timeless. One thing that really stands out revisiting Terminator 2 today is how visually specific the film feels, and I mean that in the best possibly way. A lot of modern blockbusters eventually blur together aesthetically, similar color grading, similar digital polish, similar flat lighting where everything looks technically expensive but somehow strangely forgettable at the same time. 2 doesn't have that problem at all. You can freeze almost any frame from this movie and recognize it instantly. The cold blue lighting, the steel textures, the glowing red future war imagery, the industrial shadows. James Cameron and cinematographer Adam Greenberg gave this film such a distinctive visual identity that it almost feels carved out of metal itself. The atmosphere begins working immediately during the opening feature war sequences. Those images are permanently burned into people's memories for a reason. Human skulls crushed beneath machine tracks, laser fire cutting through smoke, massive hunter killers drifting through a darkness. It feels less like polished futuristic science fiction and more like a civilization collapsing into machinery. And the cinematography matters enormously there. Everything looks cold, harsh, mechanical. Even the fire somehow feels metallic in this movie. Then the story shifts into present-day Los Angeles, but the atmosphere never fully relaxes. Cameron keeps tension hanging over everything visually. Night scene as aglow with deep blue tones. Reflections bounce across chrome surfaces. Headlights cut through darkness, like searchlights scanning for targets. The movie constantly feels suspended between the real world and the nightmare future, waiting beneath it. Honestly, Cameron's obsession with blue lighting is everywhere throughout it, and somehow it works perfectly. Normally, describing a film as blue sounds almost lifeless, but here those cold tones create mood constantly. Hospitals feel sterile and claustrophobic. Industrial environments feel almost post-apocalyptic. Even quieter scenes carry this chilly atmosphere, reminding you the future war is always looming somewhere in the background. And then whenever Cameron wants contrast, he introduces fire. The nuclear nightmare sequence is probably the strongest visual example of that entire approach. The playground scene remains horrifying because it initially looks so ordinary, bright daylight, children playing, calm suburban routine. Then suddenly the blast wave arrives and the frame transforms into this inferno of heat and destruction. That image of Sarah Connor gripping the fence while flames consume everything around her. Honestly, that's the kind of cinematic imagery that stays with people for decades. It isn't simply spectacle. It feels like trauma burned directly into the film itself. I also love how physical the environments feel throughout the movie. The biker bar, the shopping mall corridors, the drainage canal, Cyberdine, the steel mill. Every location has texture, real texture. You can practically feel the concrete, steel, sweat, grease, and heat. The world never feels digitally assembled. It feels lived in. That's a huge reason that the action sequences still hold up so well, too. The cinematography gives the movie weight. Cameron never shoots action like random chaos stitched together in editing. There's always a spatial clarity. You understand where characters are positioned, where danger is approaching from, how close everything feels. The camera moves with a purpose instead of shaking wildly to imitate intensity. And honestly, some of the compositions in this movie are simply iconic. Arnold stepping out during the elevator sequence, the T-1000 emerging from flames, Sarah in the asylum hallway, the slow motion reveal at the mall, the silhouette during the steel mill climax. The film constantly creates imagery that feels mythic without becoming overly stylized. That balance is incredibly difficult to achieve because Tito absolutely feels cinematic and heightened, but it never drifts into cartoon territory. Even with the liquid metal machines and time travel, the world itself remains grounded enough for the danger to feel emotionally real. There's also something very smart about the way Cameron visually separates the two Terminators. The T-800 feels heavy and industrial. Leather jackets, motorcycles, shotguns, steel machinery. Everything surrounding Arnold carries this brute force physicality. The T-1000, meanwhile, feels sleek and reflective. Cleaner lines, policia uniforms, smooth surfaces. Even the lighting around him often feels colder and more sterile. Cameron subtly reinforces the idea that this machinea represents a newer, more advanced evolution. And the future where glimpses almost feel like fragments from an entirely different movie in terms of atmosphere. Those scenes are terrifying precisely because they remain brief. Cameron never settles into them long enough for the audience to become comfortable. You see flashes, metal skeletons moving through smoke, humans hiding underground, machines dominating the sky, and your imagination fills in the rest. That restraint makes the future feel larger. I honestly think that's one of the reasons the movie aged so gracefully. Overall, Cameron wasn't chasing temporary visual trends. He was constructing a mood, a visual language. Everything in the film, the lighting, a production design, framing, color palette, feeds into this larger idea of humanity trapped between cold machinery and extinction. Even the steel mill finale feels symbolic visually. Fiery against metal, heat against machinery, a human emotion colliding with something mechanical and inhuman. And honestly, there's a reason so many action movies afterward tried imitating the Tita aesthetic, the metallic blues, industrial locations, slow motion hero imagery, machine versus human iconography. You can see echoes of these film all across 1990s science fiction action cinema afterward, but very few captured the same atmosphere because they copied the surface without understanding the emotion underneath it. 2 doesn't simply look cool, it feels haunted. If there's one thing Terminator 2 absolutely refuses to do, it slows momentum. This movie moves. And I don't just mean there are explosions happening constantly. Plenty of action films have explosions. 2 has propulsion. Every sequence feels like it's driving the story forward while simultaneously trying to surpass whatever came before it. What's remarkable is how early the movie starts operating at full intensity. 2. The mall sequence alone would probably serve as the climax of a lesser film. Cameron stages that entire scene with incredible escalation, gradually building tension before the audience fully understands exactly what's about to happen. You've got John Connor casually wandering through the mall, the T-1000 quietly closing in, Arnold arriving like some leather-jacketed force of nature. Then suddenly, shotguns erupt, motorcycles crash through glass, crowds panic, and honestly, the movie barely slows down after that point. And that hallway reveal still works perfectly. Arnold stepping forward with a shotgun and telling John to get down is one of those pure movie star moments where you can practically imagine theaters erupting back in 1991. Cameron understood exactly how to stage spectacle for maximum impact. But the thing that really separates it from a lot of action cinema is that the sequences feel physical. That's the word I keep returning to. Physical. The drainage canal pursuit is probably the best example. A dirt bike racing through those enormous concrete flood channels, so while a massive truck tears after it genuinely feels dangerous. The truck itself almost becomes a monster during the sequence. It's loud, heavy, unstable, tearing through everything in its path while the T-1000 calmly continues advancing without urgency or panic. And then Arnold arrives on the motorcycle. Honestly, that entire pursuit sequence is blockbuster filmmaking operating at full capacity. The jumps, the shotgun reload spin, the pacing, the way Cameron constantly changes camera angles without sacrificing spatial clarity. It's chaos but carefully controlled chaos. You always understand where everyone is positioned. That's something modern action cinema strangely struggles with sometimes. So many contemporary blockbusters cut every half second until entire sequences become visual noise. Cameron directs action with clarity. He wants the audience to actually see what's happening, and because of that, the danger feels more immediate. The hospital escape sequence is another perfect example because it's built more around suspense than destruction. Sarah Connor escaping confinement, believing for one brief moment that she's free, only to turn the corner and suddenly find herself face to face with the T-800 again. That moment still works flawlessly. Then the T-1000 appears behind her and instantly the attention shifts all over again. That's one of Cameron's greatest strengths throughout the film. He constantly changes the flavor of the action. Sometimes it's explosive spectacle, Sometimes it's suspense. Sometimes it's a pure pursuit. The movie continually evolves its energy instead of repeating identical beats. Even the Cyberdynia assault feels completely different from the earlier action sequences. That section carries heavier emotional weight because now the characters are actively trying to prevent Judgment Day rather than merely survive it. You've got SWAT teams, shattered glass, miniguns, exploding police vehicles, but underneath all of it, there's a desperation now. And somehow the movie still finds room for unforgettably moments within the chaos. Arnold reloading the shotgun one-handedly riding the Harley. The T-1000 sprinting after vehicles like exhaustion it doesn't exist for him. Sarah leaning out of moving cars, firing rifles. The helicopter flying beneath the bridge during the freeway pursuit, which honestly still feels insane every single time you watch it. Seriously. Every time that sequence happens, part of my brain still thinks there's no way they actually did that. And the answer I said they kind of did. That practical stunt work is a huge reason the action still feels alive today. There's real machinery colliding on screen, real explosions, real momentum. The movie understands physical weight in a way many CGI heavy action films no longer do. And then there's the steel mill climax. Honestly, what I love about the finale is that it doesn't simply escalate into larger explosions for the sake of escalation. The environment itself matters. Heat chains, molten steel, massive industrial machinery. The setting transforms into this mechanical nightmare where every surface feels dangerous. The T-1000 becomes especially terrifying during the final act because the damage finally begins affecting him in unpredictable ways. He's glitching, morphing uncontrollably, becoming unstable. The spectacle is directly tied to the story instead of existing separately from it. That's important because Cameron never treats action as filler. Every major sequence changes something emotionally or narratively. The characters become more desperate, more exhausted, more vulnerable as the movie progresses. Even the quieter action moments carry a meaning. Take the scene where the T-800 lowers his weapon because John tells him not to take lives. That small moral adjustment completely changes how the action functions moving forward. Suddenly, the confrontations become less about destruction and more about survival. And honestly, the pacing of the spectacle is kind of genius. Cameron knows exactly when to accelerate and exactly when to let the audience breathe for a moment. If the movie stayed at maximum intensity non-stop, it would become exhausting. Instead, he spaces the action carefully, so each sequence feels like escalation rather than noise. By the end, the film has delivered motorcycles, trucks, helicopters, SWAT assaults, machine gun firefights, molten steel, explosions, and hand-to-hand machine combat. And somehow, it never feels bloated. That's difficult to achieve. A lot of giant action movies become louder as they progress but less exciting because the spectacle loses shape. They became film history moments. Even people who haven't watched it closely can usually identify those images immediately. That's cultural permanence. And what's interesting is that for all the technological innovation and giant-scale filmmaking, the thing that probably cemented the movie forever was the emotional core underneath all of it. The relationship between John and the T-800 gave audiences something human to hold onto inside all the spectacle. Without that, maybe the movie becomes an impressive technical achievement from the 1990s. With it, the film became timeless. That's the difference. A movie can revolutionize visual effects for a few years. Very few movies remain emotionally alive for decades. The strange thing about the Terminator franchise after Tito is that almost every sequel feels like it's trying to answer the same impossible question. How do you continue a story that already felt complete? Because honestly, Terminator 2 ends with so much emotional and thematic closure that continuing beyond it almost feels unnatural. The antagonist is destroyed. Judgment Day might finally be prevented. The Terminator sacrifices himself. Sarah Connor finally allows herself a little hope for the future. It feels finished, not franchise finished. Obviously, Hollywood would never leave something this successful alone, but emotionally finished. Cameron very clearly approached 2 as the conclusion of a story, not the midpoint of an endless cinematic universe. And I think that's why every movie afterwards struggled in different ways. Now, to be fair, not every post-Hitler film is terrible. Some are genuinely entertaining. A few even contain interesting ideas buried inside them, but none of them fully escaped the shadow of those first two Cameron films, and that shadow is enormous. Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines is probably the clearest example of this strange franchise problem. On one hand, it's entertaining. Arnold still has presence. Several of the action sequences work well. And honestly, the ending takes a surprisingly dark direction that I appreciate more now than I did years ago. But the movie also feels trapped trying to imitate Titwa without fully understanding why Titwa worked emotionally. It has the shape of a Terminator movie. Pursuits, a new advanced Terminator, callback dialogue, large explosions, but something underneath feels missing. The emotional weight isn't the same. The dread and the same. It feels more like a studio continuation than a story Cameron urgently needed to tell. Then you get a Terminator Salvation, which honestly deserves credit simply for attempting something different. That movie finally says, enough time travel. Let's actually stay in the future war. And honestly, that's an idea fans had wanted for years. Parts of Salvation actually have an interesting atmosphere, too. Burned out wastelands, machine warfare, a humanity barely surviving. There are moments where you can feel the film reaching for something darker and more desperate. But again, it never fully lands emotionally the way the first films did. A lot of viewers walked away thinking that was decent rather than that was essential. And that's kind of been the recurring challenge for the franchise. After Titwa, the sequels often feel like variations of familiar material instead of films creating an identity powerful enough to stand beside Cameron's work. Then came Terminator Genesis, which honestly feels like the franchise attempting to reboot itself while simultaneously remixing its own nostalgia. Alternate timelines, younger versions of familiar characters, classic scenes recreated through a different lens. It's basically the Terminator franchise performing continuous gymnastics. Some viewers enjoy the sheer chaos of that approach. Others are completely disconnected from it. But again, the movie spends so much energy referencing earlier Terminator films that it struggles to feel entirely confident as its own identity. And then there's Dark Fate, which was especially interesting because James Cameron actually returned creatively in a producer role, and the marketing heavily emphasized the idea that this was the real continuation after Titwa. Bringing Linda Hamilton back was honestly one of the smartest decisions that movie made. The second Sarah Connor appears on screen again, you instantly remember how important she was to the emotional soul of the franchise. And Dark Fate absolutely has moments where you can feel that older energy trying to return. The action works. Some of the ideas are genuinely solid. Hamilton still completely commands the screen. But even there, the movie can't fully escape the gravitational pull of Terminator 2. It constantly reminds you of the earlier films because the identity of the franchise became permanently tied to those original Cameron stories, and that's the difficult part. The first Terminator films weren't simply successful franchise entries. They became defining science fiction landmarks. Once that happens, every continuation afterward gets judged against almost impossible standards automatically. And honestly, I think a part of the challenge is that the franchise concept itself becomes strangely limiting over time. There are only so many times audiences can watch. Advanced Terminator travels back in time. Resistance sends Protector. Pursuit begins. Eventually, the formula becomes visible. The first movie made it terrifying. 2 made it emotional and mythic. After that, many of the latter sequels started feeling like rearrangements of familiar pieces rather than meaningful evolutions of the idea itself, which is why people continually circle back to Cameron's originals. Not simply because of nostalgia, but because the two films genuinely complement each other perfectly. The first movie is the nightmare. The second movie is the emotional epic. Together, they almost feel complete enough that the franchise doesn't necessarily require additional chapters afterward. And honestly, that isn't really an insult to the latter films. It's more a reflection of how difficult it is to follow something that already reached such a rare cultural level. Because the truth is, Most franchises would consider them Sylvester incredibly fortunate to produce even only a film as influential as the Terminator or a Terminator 2. This series produced two. That's why even the weaker sequels still remain part of the conversation. People keep returning because the core concept itself remains powerful. Machine as a hunting humanity, fate, technology, a survival. There's always potential there. But Cameron's first two films set the standard so high that every sequel afterward feels like it's chasing ghosts a little, trying to recapture lightning that already struck twice. At the end of the day, Terminator 2, Judgment Day is one of those movies that almost feels too large to fully summarize because depending on who you are, it becomes a completely different experience. For some people, it's the ultimate action movie. For others, it's peak science fiction. Some watch it for the groundbreaking visual effects. Some for Arnold Schwarzenegger at maximum movie star presence. Some for Sarah Connor's transformation. Some for the emotional father-son dynamic between John and the T-800. And honestly, a lot of viewers probably arrived expecting explosions and left unexpectedly emotional by the ending. That's kind of the genius of the film. It works on multiple levels without ever feeling like it's desperately trying to prove its importance. And what really impresses me revisiting it now is how confidently made it is. Cameron directs this movie like someone fully aware he's creating something massive, but he never loses control of it. The pacing remains sharp, the action remains coherent, the emotional scenes mostly land. Even the spectacle, which could have easily overwhelmed everything else, still serves the story rather than replacing it. That balance is rare, especially in a blockbuster filmmaking, because a load of giant movies either become emotionally empty or collapse under the weight of their own ambition. Tito somehow avoids both traps. It's enormous, loud, emotional, funny, dark, hopeful, violent, surprisingly heartfelt, and somehow it still feels focused. You can absolutely criticize parts of it, though. The time travel mechanics become messy if you overanalyze them. Certain pieces of dialogue haven't aged perfectly. Some viewers still prefer the raw horror atmosphere of the original film. Edward Furlong's performance remains divisive. And yes, Cameron occasionally indulges the spectacle slightly too much because he's clearly having an incredible time blowing things up. But honestly, those flaws feel relatively small compared to what the movie accomplishes overall. Because when 2 is working, and most of the time it absolutely is, it feels almost untouchable. The drainage cannula pursuit still excites audiences. The T-1000 still feels threatening. Sarah Connor still feels iconic. Arnold still dominates the screen. The effects still hold up remarkably well, and somehow against all odds, the emotional ending still lands. That's the part that really stays with me. A lot of movies eventually become nostalgia pieces where audiences mainly remember how exciting they once felt. Tito absolutely carries nostalgia now obviously, but it survives beyond nostalgia because the craftsmanship underneath it remains genuinely strong. The filmmaking still works, the atmosphere still works, the emotional core still works. And honestly, I think one of the most impressive things about Terminator 2 is that it never feels cynical. Even at its loudest and most crowd-pleasing, there's a sincerity running through the entire movie. Cameron genuinely cares about these characters. He cares about the themes. He cares about humanity's relationship with technology, the idea of fate, and the possibility that people could still choose a better future. That sincerity gives the spectacle emotional weight. Without it, maybe the movie becomes simply another entertaining 1990s blockbuster with impressive effects. Instead, it became one of the defining action films ever made. And maybe that's why audiences still debate whether it's better than the original after all these years. Usually, when people argue passionately about films for decades, it means both movies matter deeply in completely different ways. The first Terminator is leaner, scarier, more intimate. T2 is larger, more emotional, more mythic. Personally, I don't even think choosing between them is really the point anymore. Together, they complement each other almost perfectly. One creates the nightmare, the other expands it into something tragic, hopeful, and strangely human. And honestly, Very few sequels in movie history managed to evolve their franchise this successfully without losing what made the original special. That alone makes Terminator 2 remarkable. But beyond all the analysis, themes, visual effects discussions, and filmmaking conversations, the simplest truth is this: the movie is still unbelievably entertaining.